The concrete felt like ice against my cheek as I begged my legs to move. Nothing. My brother Danny stood above me, his 16th birthday grin fading as I whispered that I couldn't feel anything below my waist. Dad's voice boomed across our backyard barbecue. "Walk it off, stop being a baby." Mom rushed over not to comfort me but to scold me for ruining Danny's special day. 50 guests watched as I lay motionless, everyone believing I was throwing another dramatic tantrum. Saturday morning arrived with that dry Arizona heat that makes your skin feel tight before 9 a.m. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home in suburban Phoenix, already dreading the next 8 hours of Danny's birthday celebration. The familiar 2-story house with its beige stucco walls and red tile roof looked the same as always, but somehow smaller, now that I lived in my own apartment across town. My 28 years felt ancient compared to Danny's 16, especially when Dad opened the front door wearing his weekend uniform of cargo shorts and a polo shirt that stretched across his expanding belly. Robert Caldwell had always been a big man, but retirement from construction work had added another 30 pounds to his 6-foot frame. "Ivy's here," he called over his shoulder without looking at me. No hello, no hug, just an announcement like I was a package delivery. Mom appeared behind him, Patricia Caldwell in her element of party preparation chaos. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and flour dusted her navy blue apron. She'd been baking Danny's favorite chocolate cake since dawn. I could smell it from the doorway. "Oh, good, you can help me set up the backyard," she said, already turning away. "Danny specifically requested the blue tablecloths, not the red ones we used for Easter." I followed them through the house, noting the family photos lining the hallway. Danny's school pictures dominated the wall, his gap-toothed smile evolving into the confident grin of a high school sophomore. My own photos appeared sporadically, mostly group shots, where I stood slightly apart from the family cluster. The backyard was already bustling with activity. Danny lounged in a folding chair near the swimming pool, his sandy brown hair catching the morning sun as he scrolled through his brand new iPhone. The latest model, I noticed, probably worth more than my monthly rent for my studio apartment. "Hey, sis," he said without looking up, his voice carrying that particular teenage combination of boredom and superiority. "Glad you could make it to the party." The way he emphasized "make it" stung a little. Last month, I'd missed his school play because of a work deadline, and the family had made sure I knew about my absence for weeks afterward. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, setting my purse on the patio table. "Happy birthday, Danny." His friend Tyler Morrison sat beside him, a gangly kid with red hair and too many freckles to count. Tyler had been Danny's shadow since middle school, always eager to please and quick to laugh at Danny's jokes, even the mean ones. "Check this out," Danny said finally, looking up from his phone screen. "Dad got me the pro version with the extra storage. I can record like 10 hours of video now." The phone gleamed in the sunlight, its pristine case still bearing the store stickers. I remembered when I was 16, begging for months just to get a basic cell phone for emergencies. Dad had lectured me about responsibility and earning privileges through good behavior. "That's really nice," I said, meaning it. Danny deserved nice things, even if the disparity between our teenage experiences sometimes felt like a knife twist. Tyler leaned closer to Danny, whispering something that made both boys snicker. Their heads bent together over the phone screen, and I caught fragments of their conversation. "Did you loosen them enough?" Tyler asked in a voice he probably thought was quiet. "Yeah, 3 full turns on each one," Danny replied, his eyes bright with mischievous excitement. "It's going to be epic when she tries to show off later." Their words didn't immediately register as concerning. Danny had always been a prankster, and teenage boys seemed to find humor in the strangest places. I turned my attention to helping Mom arrange the party decorations, hanging blue streamers from the patio umbrella and setting up folding tables around the pool area. Extended family began arriving around noon. Uncle Marcus brought his wife Susan and their twin daughters, 8-year-old girls who immediately gravitated toward the swimming pool, despite the early season coolness. Aunt Linda came with her latest boyfriend, a quiet man named Steve, who seemed overwhelmed by the Caldwell family energy. The neighborhood friends followed along with Danny's classmates and their parents. Our backyard filled with the comfortable chaos of a suburban birthday party. Hamburgers sizzled on Dad's Pride and Joy gas grill, a massive stainless steel contraption he'd installed 2 summers ago. The pool filter hummed its familiar rhythm, while children's laughter echoed off the house walls. I found myself gravitating toward Uncle Marcus, Dad's younger brother, who had always been kinder to me than the rest of the family. He worked as an accountant and possessed a gentle demeanor that contrasted sharply with Dad's boisterous personality. "How's the marketing job treating you?" he asked, genuine interest warming his brown eyes. "Pretty well." I replied, grateful for adult conversation that didn't involve party logistics. "I just landed a big client, actually, a tech startup that wants to rebrand their whole image." "That sounds exciting. You always were the creative one in the family." Before I could respond, Dad's voice boomed across the yard. "Ivy, get over here. Mrs. Henderson was just asking about your gymnastic days." My stomach clenched. Mrs. Henderson, our next-door neighbor for the past 15 years, was a sweet woman in her 70s who remembered everyone's childhood achievements with uncomfortable accuracy. "Oh, you were so graceful on that trampoline," she said, gesturing toward the large, circular trampoline that dominated one corner of our backyard. "I used to watch you practice from my kitchen window. Those backflips were just beautiful." The trampoline had been my refuge during high school, a place where I could escape family tension and lose myself in the simple joy of defying gravity. I'd spent countless hours perfecting my technique, dreaming of making the varsity gymnastics team that never quite materialized due to budget cuts. "That was a long time ago," I said, hoping to deflect attention away from the topic. But Dad was already warming to the theme, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted to be the center of attention. "Come on, Ivy, show everyone you've still got it. Danny's never seen you do a proper backflip." I glanced toward Danny, who was watching with newfound interest, his phone camera already pointing in my direction. Tyler grinned beside him, that same mischievous expression I'd noticed earlier. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, recognizing the warning signs of a family spectacle. "I haven't practiced in years." Mom appeared at my elbow, her expression mixing encouragement with subtle pressure. "Oh, don't be such a spoil sport. It's Danny's birthday, and everyone wants to see what you can do. Besides, you need to loosen up and have fun for once." The familiar guilt settled around my shoulders like a heavy blanket. This was my role in the family dynamic, the responsible older sister, who took things too seriously and needed constant reminding to be more spontaneous. "Just one flip." Dad insisted, his hand landing on my shoulder with enough pressure to make his expectation clear. "For Danny's birthday, make it special for him." I looked around the circle of expectant faces, neighbors and relatives waiting for the entertainment portion of the afternoon. Danny's eyes held a particular gleam that I'd seen before, usually right before some practical joke that left me feeling foolish. "All right," I heard myself saying, "but just one, and everyone needs to stay back from the trampoline." The crowd cheered, and I felt that familiar mixture of attention and anxiety that had defined my teenage years. As I walked toward the trampoline, kicking off my sandals on the warm concrete, I noticed Danny and Tyler exchanging another meaningful look. The trampoline's surface felt slightly different under my bare feet, less responsive than I remembered. I bounced gently a few times, testing my balance and trying to recapture the muscle memory from 10 years ago. My body felt heavier, less flexible, but the basic movements came back gradually. "Whenever you're ready," Dad called out his phone, joining Danny's in recording the moment. I took a deep breath, focused on a point beyond the trampoline's edge, and launched into the familiar sequence. 3 small bounces to build momentum, then the powerful jump that should have carried me through a perfect backward rotation. Instead, something went catastrophically wrong. The trampoline surface gave way beneath me with a metallic shriek, springs snapping and cables whipping through the air. Instead of the controlled arc I'd planned, my body tumbled at a sickening angle, heading directly toward the concrete patio that surrounded the pool area. The impact drove every bit of air from my lungs, and my head struck the ground with a sound that silenced the entire party. For a moment, everything went gray around the edges, and I lay still, waiting for my body to recover from the shock. But as the seconds ticked by, a terrible realization crept through my consciousness. I couldn't feel my legs. I couldn't feel anything below my waist. When I tried to move to roll over or push myself up, nothing happened. "Danny." I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sudden chaos of adult voices. "Danny, something's wrong. I can't move my legs." The silence that followed my whispered words felt heavier than the Arizona heat, pressing down on our backyard. I lay on the concrete, my cheek against the rough surface, staring at Danny's sneakers just 2 feet from my face. The bright white leather was unmarked, pristine, like everything else he owned. "Come on, Ivy." Dad's voice cut through the stillness, carrying that familiar edge of irritation. "This isn't funny anymore. Get up." I tried to explain that I wasn't joking, that something had gone terribly wrong with my body, but my voice came out as barely more than a breath. The taste of blood filled my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall. Mom's shadow fell across my face as she knelt beside me, but her touch on my shoulder felt clinical rather than comforting. "Ivy, honey, you're scaring the children. This really isn't the time or place for one of your episodes." Episodes. The word hit me like a physical blow. Throughout my childhood, anytime I'd gotten genuinely hurt or upset, Mom had dismissed it as attention-seeking behavior. A sprained wrist from falling off my bike became an episode. Food poisoning that kept me home from school was an episode. Even when I'd cried at my high school graduation because none of my family had shown up, that too had been labeled dramatic overreaction. "Please," I managed to say louder this time. "I really can't feel my legs. Something's wrong with my back." Tyler Morrison shifted nervously beside Danny, his freckled face pale despite the heat. "Maybe we should call someone," he said in a voice that cracked mid-sentence. "She doesn't look right." Danny finally spoke, but his words chilled me more than the concrete beneath my cheek. "She's fine. She always does stuff like this when she wants attention. Remember last Christmas when she claimed she was allergic to something in dinner? That had been real, too. I discovered a shellfish allergy the hard way during Mom's seafood casserole experiment, but my hives and difficulty breathing had been attributed to stress and drama-seeking, until Uncle Marcus drove me to urgent care. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of my vision, her wrinkled hands twisted together with worry. "Robert, something isn't right here. Look at how she's lying. That's not normal." Dad's response came sharp and defensive. "Martha, I appreciate your concern, but we know our daughter. Ivy's been pulling stunts like this since she was 12 years old. She'll be up and walking around in 5 minutes, just you watch." But the minutes crawled by and I remained motionless on the concrete. The party guests stood in an uncomfortable circle around me, unsure whether to stay or leave. Someone's child started crying, confused by the adult tension that had suddenly replaced birthday celebration joy. Uncle Marcus pushed through the crowd, his accountant's methodical nature taking over. "This has gone on long enough," he said, pulling out his cell phone. "I'm calling 911. "You absolutely are not." Dad snapped, his voice rising to that dangerous level I remembered from childhood arguments. "We're not turning my son's birthday party into a circus because Ivy decided to throw a tantrum." "Robert, look at her," Uncle Marcus insisted. "Really look at her. Something's genuinely wrong here." I tried to turn my head to see Uncle Marcus to communicate that he was right, but even that small movement sent lightning bolts of pain through my skull. The world tilted sideways and I tasted bile rising in my throat. Mrs. Henderson had moved closer during the family argument, and I felt her cool hand touch my forehead. "Sweetheart, can you wiggle your toes for me?" I concentrated with everything I had, willing my feet to move. Nothing. Not even the smallest sensation of muscle response. Terror began to replace confusion as the reality of my situation settled in. "I can't," I whispered to Mrs. Henderson. "I can't move anything." She straightened up with surprising speed for a woman her age. "That's it. I'm calling for help whether you like it or not, Robert." The argument that followed blurred together in my memory, voices rising and overlapping as family loyalty clashed with common sense. Mom accused Mrs. Henderson of interfering in private family matters. Dad threatened to ban her from future neighborhood gatherings. Uncle Marcus stood his ground about calling emergency services, while Tyler Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Through it all, Danny remained strangely quiet, his earlier smirk replaced by something harder to read. He kept glancing between me and the damaged trampoline his new phone clutched tight in his hands. Mrs. Henderson ignored the family chaos and walked purposefully toward her house to make the call. 3 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens began to echo through our neighborhood. The first responder to arrive was a paramedic named Sarah Chen, a compact woman in her 30s who moved with professional efficiency. She pushed through the cluster of party guests without ceremony, her trained eyes immediately assessing my position and condition. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked, kneeling beside me with a medical bag that smelled of antiseptic and leather. "Ivy Caldwell." I replied, grateful to have someone who seemed to take my situation seriously. Sarah's hands moved gently over my head and neck, checking for obvious injuries while she continued her assessment. "Ivy, I need you to try moving your fingers for me. Can you make a fist?" I could. My hands responded normally, which somehow made the complete absence of sensation below my waist even more terrifying. "Good. Now try to move your legs just a little bit." I concentrated until sweat beaded on my forehead, but my legs might as well have belonged to someone else entirely. Sarah's expression grew grave as she checked my pupils with a small flashlight. Whatever she saw there made her reach for her radio with urgent efficiency. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7-4. I need immediate trauma response and police backup to 247 Saguaro Drive. We have a potential spinal injury with concerning neurological signs." Police backup. The word sent a chill through the gathered crowd that had nothing to do with the evening air beginning to cool around us. Dad stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. This is a family matter and we don't need police involved in our business." Sarah looked up from her examination with steel in her voice. "Sir, when we have a potential serious injury involving a damaged piece of equipment, we follow protocol. Please step back and let me do my job." As if to emphasize her point, she turned her attention back to me, checking my pupils again with obvious concern. "Ivy, I'm seeing some uneven pupil response which suggests possible head trauma, in addition to the spinal injury. We're going to get you to the hospital right away." The word spinal hit the party guests like a physical blow. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and even the children seemed to sense that something terrible had happened to their afternoon celebration. Sarah spoke into her radio again. "Also request supervisor and detective to scene. I'm observing evidence of equipment tampering that may have contributed to this injury." Equipment tampering. My blood turned to ice as the implication sank in. This hadn't been an accident or equipment failure. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the trampoline. I turned my head just enough to catch Danny's expression, and what I saw there confirmed my worst fears. Guilt panic and the dawning realization that his epic prank had gone catastrophically wrong. The approaching sirens grew louder, promising help and answers, but also the end of whatever normal life I'd built for myself over the past 10 years. As I lay motionless on the concrete surrounded by the ruins of a birthday party and a family that still refused to believe my pain was real, I couldn't have imagined how much worse things were about to become. The ambulance ride to Phoenix General Hospital passed in a blur of medical terminology and urgent radio chatter. Sarah, the paramedic, maintained steady pressure on my neck with a stabilization collar, while her partner navigated through Saturday afternoon traffic with lights and sirens clearing the way. "Ivy, I need you to stay awake for me," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the fog that kept trying to claim my consciousness. "Tell me about your job. What do you do for work?" "Marketing coordinator." I managed Grateful for something normal to focus on. I help small businesses with their advertising strategies. "That sounds interesting. Do you like it?" I tried to nod but remembered the neck brace. "Most days. It's better than working for my family's construction company. Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with her partner, Officer James Wilson, who had followed the ambulance in his patrol car and was now riding along to maintain the chain of evidence. He was a tall man with graying temples who radiated the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. The equipment at the scene showed clear signs of deliberate tampering, he said to Sarah in a voice he probably thought I couldn't hear. Multiple spring bolts had been loosened systematically. This wasn't wear and tear or manufacturing defect. The words confirmed what I'd begun to suspect during those terrible moments lying on the concrete. Danny's whispered conversation with Tyler, his excited anticipation, the way he'd encouraged me to use the trampoline, it all made horrible sense now. Phoenix General's emergency department buzzed with controlled chaos as my gurney rolled through the automatic doors. Bright fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes, while medical staff surrounded me with practiced efficiency. The antiseptic smell brought back memories of childhood visits for Danny's various sports injuries, but this time I was the patient instead of the forgotten sister waiting in uncomfortable chairs. Dr. Rachel Martinez took charge immediately, a woman in her 40s, whose confident manner suggested extensive trauma experience. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her brown eyes missed nothing as she conducted her initial examination. Patient is 28-year-old female with complete loss of sensation and motor function below the waist following a fall from height, she announced to the medical team. Possible head trauma with pupil inequality. I want full spinal imaging, CT scan of the head and blood work stat. My parents arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing their party clothes, and expressions of profound irritation. Dad's cargo shorts and polo shirt looked absurdly casual in the sterile hospital environment, while Mom clutched her purse like a shield against unwanted medical expenses. "How long is this going to take?" Dad asked the registration clerk, his voice carrying across the waiting area. "We have guests to get back to, and my son's birthday party isn't over yet." Mom approached my gurney with the same energy she'd used to criticize my party planning earlier. "Ivy, this has gone far enough. You've completely ruined Danny's special day, and now you're embarrassing the whole family with this hospital nonsense." Dr. Martinez looked up from my chart with an expression that could have frozen water. "Excuse me, are you this patient's family?" "We're her parents," Dad said, puffing out his chest in preparation for asserting parental authority. "And we want to know when we can take her home. This whole situation has been blown way out of proportion. Mr. Caldwell, your daughter, has suffered what appears to be a serious spinal injury. She's not going anywhere until we determine the full extent of her condition." "Spinal injury," Mom repeated with a laugh that held no humor. "Doctor, you don't know Ivy like we do. She's been pulling dramatic stunts like this since she was a child. There's nothing wrong with her that some attention won't cure." I wanted to scream at them to demand they listen to the medical professional instead of dismissing my pain as performance art. But the sedative they'd given me for the imaging tests was making everything feel distant and underwater. Dr. Martinez's voice carried new steel when she responded. "Mrs. Caldwell, your daughter is showing clear neurological deficits consistent with spinal cord trauma. This is not a behavioral issue or attention-seeking. This is a medical emergency." Behind them, I could see Officer Wilson interviewing Tyler Morrison in the hallway. Tyler's parents flanked him, their faces pale with shock as their son's words tumbled out in a rush of confession and terror. "He said it would just make her bounce funny," Tyler was saying, his voice carrying despite the family's attempts to whisper. Danny researched it online. He knew exactly which bolts to loosen to make the spring snap when someone jumped hard enough. The words hit my parents like physical blows. Mom's face went white and Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. Dr. Martinez had been listening too, and she excused herself to speak with Officer Wilson. Their conversation lasted several minutes, punctuated by pointing toward evidence bags that contained bolts and springs from our backyard trampoline. When she returned, Dr. Martinez's demeanor had shifted into something more formal and cautious. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, I need to inform you that we're required to report this incident to Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. The evidence suggests this injury resulted from deliberate sabotage rather than an accident. That's ridiculous. Dad blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Danny's just a kid. Kids play pranks. This is all being blown out of proportion by people who don't understand teenage behavior. Mom tried a different approach, reaching for my hand with sudden maternal concern. Ivy, honey, you know Danny didn't mean to hurt you. He was just being playful. You're not really going to press charges against your own brother, are you? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of family dynamics and unspoken expectations. Even lying on a hospital gurney, unable to feel half my body, I was being asked to protect Danny from the consequences of his actions. But before I could respond, Dr. Martinez returned with a manila folder thick with test results. Her expression was grim as she pulled up a chair beside my bed. Ivy, I have your imaging results. I need to be completely honest with you about what we found. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of medical monitors and the distant sounds of the emergency department. Even my parents stopped their protestations to listen. Dr. Martinez opened the folder and pulled out what looked like X-ray images, though the details meant nothing to my untrained eye. The MRI shows complete severing of your spinal cord at the L2 vertebra. This type of injury typically results in permanent paralysis of the lower extremities. Permanent paralysis. The words echoed in my head like stones dropped into a deep well. Additionally, Dr. Martinez continued, the imaging revealed evidence of previous injuries that were never properly treated. Old fractures in your ribs, a healed break in your left wrist that was set incorrectly, and signs of repeated minor trauma that suggest a pattern extending back several years. Officer Wilson stepped forward, his notebook ready. Doctor, are you saying there's evidence of a history of abuse? I'm saying there's medical evidence of multiple untreated injuries that raise questions about the level of care this patient has received. I'm legally obligated to report these findings to the appropriate authorities. The implications crashed over the room like a tsunami. Mom began crying, but whether from grief or fear was impossible to determine. Dad's face cycled through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. From the hallway came the sound of Danny's voice, higher pitched than usual, as another officer interviewed him about his prank planning. Every word carried clearly through the thin hospital walls. I just wanted to embarrass her a little, he was saying. She always acts like she's so much better than everyone else. You know, I thought if she fell funny or couldn't do her stupid flip, people would stop talking about how great she used to be. Even through my medication haze, the casual cruelty of his words cut deep. This hadn't been a momentary lapse of judgment or innocent prank gone wrong. This had been calculated humiliation that had destroyed my life as completely as any weapon. Dr. Martinez closed the folder and looked directly at my parents. I'm admitting Ivy for extended observation and treatment planning. Social services will be conducting interviews with all family members over the next few days. I strongly suggest you contact an attorney. The word attorney seemed to flip a switch in Dad's brain. All his bluster and denial evaporated, replaced by the cold calculation of a man realizing he might face serious legal consequences. We want to see Danny, he said, right now, and we're not answering any more questions without legal representation. As my parents hurried from the room to find my brother, I lay in the hospital bed processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Not only was I permanently paralyzed, but the family dysfunction I'd spent years trying to ignore was about to be exposed to the legal system. Dr. Martinez remained beside my bed, her expression softening now that we were alone. Ivy, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We have resources, support systems, and legal advocates who can help you navigate what comes next. I tried to respond, but the words caught in my throat. The girl who had gotten up that morning planning to endure a few hours of family obligation would never walk again. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part of this nightmare. The worst part was that deep down, I wasn't entirely surprised. Sunday morning brought a parade of medical specialists to my hospital room, each offering a different piece of the devastating puzzle that my life had become. Dr. Martinez arrived first, accompanied by Dr. Kevin Ross, a neurologist, whose gentle manner couldn't soften the brutal facts he delivered. The MRI confirms complete transaction of the spinal cord. Dr. Ross explained, pointing to images on his tablet that looked like abstract art to me. The L2 injury means you'll retain full function of your arms and torso, but there will be no sensation or voluntary movement below that point. No sensation or voluntary movement. The clinical language made it sound almost manageable, but the reality sat in my chest like a lead weight. I would never feel sand between my toes again, never run for a bus, never dance at a wedding. How complete is complete? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Dr. Ross hesitated the pause, telling me everything I needed to know. With this type of injury, recovery of function is extremely unlikely. We're looking at permanent paralysis. The word permanent echoed in the sterile hospital air final as a coffin lid closing. Dr. Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her expression mixing professional compassion with something harder to define. Ivy, there's something else we need to discuss. When we examined the older injuries visible on your scans, we found patterns that concern us. She produced a different set of images pointing to areas that glowed white against the dark background. This rib fracture happened approximately 4 years ago and was never properly set. These stress fractures in your left wrist show evidence of repeated impact trauma. There are also signs of previous concussion damage that was never diagnosed or treated. I stared at the screen memories flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. The rib injury had happened during Danny's 13th birthday party when his wrestling demonstration with his friends had gotten out of hand. I'd been knocked into the pool's concrete edge hard enough to see stars, but Dad had insisted I was fine after I got my breath back. The wrist fractures were from last Christmas when I'd slipped on ice while carrying packages to my car after our family gathering. Mom had given me ibuprofen and told me to stop complaining about minor aches and pains. Why is this relevant now? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Dr. Martinez exchanged a look with Dr. Ross before responding. IV medical professionals are mandated reporters. When we see patterns of untreated injuries, especially in conjunction with current trauma, that appears to be the result of deliberate harm, we're legally required to report our concerns to authorities. The implications hit me like cold water. Not only was I facing permanent disability, but my family's years of neglect and dismissal were about to become part of a criminal investigation. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and Officer Wilson appeared in the doorway. Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, a professional-looking Hispanic woman in her 40s, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested legal training. "Miss Caldwell, this is Detective Linda Foster," Officer Wilson said. "She'll be handling the investigation into your brother's actions and the circumstances surrounding your injury." Detective Foster approached my bed with measured steps, her dark eyes taking in the medical equipment and my obvious condition. "Miss Caldwell, I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances. I understand you're dealing with a lot right now, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened yesterday." Before we begin, Dr. Martinez interjected, "I should inform you that we've discovered evidence of multiple previous untreated injuries that raise additional concerns." Detective Foster's expression sharpened with interest. "What kind of evidence?" Dr. Ross pulled up the images on his tablet again, walking through the catalog of old injuries with clinical precision. With each revelation, Detective Foster's notes grew more detailed, her questions more pointed. "Miss Caldwell, can you tell me about these previous incidents? When they occurred, how your family responded, whether you received medical attention?" The questions opened a floodgate of memories I'd spent years trying to forget. The family camping trip where I'd fallen from a climbing tree and limped for weeks while Dad insisted I was exaggerating. The high school graduation party where I'd gotten food poisoning that turned out to be an allergic reaction dismissed as attention-seeking until I passed out. dozens of smaller incidents where my pain had been minimized, ignored, or blamed on my supposed need for drama. My family doesn't really believe in making a fuss about minor injuries. I found myself saying, then immediately felt disloyal for the understatement. Detective Foster set down her pen and looked directly at me. Miss Caldwell, based on what I'm hearing from medical staff and what we discovered at the scene yesterday, this goes well beyond family differences of opinion about medical care. Your brother deliberately sabotaged equipment with the specific intention of causing you to fall. That constitutes assault with a deadly weapon under Arizona law. Assault with a deadly weapon. The phrase sent chills through me that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. There's more, Detective Foster continued. We've been interviewing witnesses from the party, including your brother's friend, Tyler Morrison. He's provided detailed information about the planning that went into this prank, including text messages and internet search history. She pulled out a manila folder and extracted what appeared to be printed screenshots. These are from your brother's phone recovered yesterday evening. They show extensive research into trampoline mechanics, safety failure points, and what he calls epic prank ideas that date back several weeks. The screenshots showed Danny's search history in devastating detail. Videos titled Trampoline Fails Compilation and How to Make Someone Fall Funny, mixed with more technical searches about spring tension and weight distribution. Most disturbing were the notes he'd typed into his phone describing his plans to teach Ivy a lesson about showing off and make her look stupid in front of everyone. He planned this. I whispered the evidence making denial impossible. Extensively, Detective Foster confirmed. But here's what concerns me most. According to Tyler Morrison's statement, this wasn't the first time your brother has planned pranks specifically targeting you. He described several previous incidents where your brother deliberately caused you minor injuries, always with your parents' knowledge and tacit approval. The room fell silent as the weight of that revelation sank in. My family hadn't just failed to protect me from Danny's cruelty, they had actively enabled it. Dr. Martinez broke the silence with professional gentleness. Ivy, I need to ask directly. Have you ever felt safe in your family home? Have there been threats, intimidation, or incidents that made you fear for your well-being? The question forced me to confront truths I'd spent years avoiding. The answer was complicated, layered with years of gaslighting and emotional manipulation that had trained me to minimize my own experiences. It wasn't like they hit me, I said carefully. It was more like they never believed me when I got hurt, or they acted like I was being dramatic when I was actually in pain. That's called medical neglect, Detective Foster said bluntly. When parents consistently fail to provide appropriate medical care for their child's injuries, it constitutes abuse under the law. The word abuse hung in the air between us, foreign and familiar at the same time. I'd never applied that label to my childhood experiences, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like a key, turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. What happens now? I asked, afraid of the answer. Detective Foster consulted her notes before responding. Your brother will be charged as a juvenile with aggravated assault. Given the premeditation and severity of the outcome, the district attorney may choose to try him as an adult. Your parents will likely face charges related to child endangerment and potentially conspiracy, depending on what we discover about their knowledge and involvement in this incident. Conspiracy. The word seemed too dramatic for a suburban family birthday party gone wrong. Miss Caldwell Tyler Morrison's statement suggests your parents were aware of your brother's pattern of targeting you with pranks. If we can prove they knew about this specific plan or actively encouraged it, that constitutes conspiracy to commit assault. As if summoned by our conversation, voices erupted from the hallway outside my room. I recognized Dad's angry tone, immediately followed by Mom's higher-pitched protests. You can't just take him, Dad was saying. He's a minor and this whole thing is being blown completely out of proportion. It was an accident, a prank gone wrong. Kids do stupid things. A calm male voice responded, though I couldn't make out the words. Then Mom's voice, shrill with panic. He didn't mean to hurt her. Danny loves his sister. He would never intentionally cause serious harm. Detective Foster stepped to the door, listening to the commotion with professional interest. After a moment, she returned to my bedside. "Your parents have hired an attorney," she said. "Jonathan Hayes from Morrison and Associates. He's advising them not to speak with police without counsel present." The fact that they'd already lawyered up while I lay paralyzed in a hospital bed spoke volumes about their priorities. Even now, facing the destruction of my life, their primary concern was protecting Danny from consequences. Dr. Martinez checked her watch and made a note in my chart. "Ivy, we're going to be transferring you to the spinal injury unit this afternoon. You'll begin working with physical therapy specialists who can help you adapt to your new circumstances." New circumstances, another euphemism for the complete obliteration of everything I'd planned for my future. "I want to call my friend Emma," I said suddenly. "She lives in Tucson, but she'll want to know what happened." "Of course," Dr. Martinez said. "But first, Detective Foster has a few more questions about your family dynamics and previous incidents. This information will be crucial for building a case that ensures justice for what's been done to you." As I prepared to relive years of dismissed pain and minimized injuries, I realized that Danny's prank had accomplished something he'd never intended. It had finally forced the truth about our family into the light, where it couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or explained away. The girl who had worried about ruining a birthday party was gone forever. In her place was a woman who would never walk again, but who might finally find the courage to demand accountability from the people who were supposed to protect her. Detective Foster's investigation moved with methodical precision over the next 48 hours. While I learned to navigate the basics of hospital bed controls and tried to process the reality of permanent paralysis, she was building a criminal case that would shatter what remained of my family's carefully constructed facade. Monday morning brought the first major breakthrough. Detective Foster arrived at my bedside carrying evidence bags and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. "Ivy, we executed a search warrant on your parents' home yesterday evening," she said, settling into the visitor's chair that was becoming as familiar as my own wheelchair. "What we discovered in your brother's room goes far beyond a simple prank gone wrong." She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me, revealing screenshots of text messages that made my blood run cold. "These are from Danny's phone dating back 3 months, Detective Foster explained. "He's been planning what he calls Operation Humble Ivy since February, right after your promotion at work made the family newsletter your mother sends to relatives." The messages showed a level of calculation that was genuinely frightening. Danny had researched not just trampoline mechanics, but also spinal injuries and their symptoms. He'd watched YouTube videos about paralysis, seeming to understand exactly what kind of damage he might cause. "Look at this exchange with Tyler Morrison from 2 weeks ago," Detective Foster said, scrolling to a particularly damning conversation. "Danny found the perfect weakness point. 3 bolts loosened exactly right will make the whole spring assembly fail when someone lands hard enough. Tyler, dude, that sounds really dangerous. What if she gets actually hurt? Danny, she deserves it for always acting like she's so much smarter than everyone. Maybe some time on her ass will teach her humility. Tyler, your parents will freak if something bad happens. Danny, they won't care. They're always telling her to stop being so dramatic anyway. They'll probably thank me for proving their point." The casual cruelty of his words hit me harder than any physical blow. This hadn't been teenage thoughtlessness or a moment of poor judgment. This had been months of premeditated planning to cause me serious harm. "There's more," Detective Foster said, pulling up another folder. "We found a notebook in his desk drawer with detailed plans for what he calls teaching Ivy lessons. This trampoline incident was apparently just the latest in a series of escalating pranks designed to humiliate and injure you. The notebook pages she showed me read like a manual for psychological warfare. Danny had cataloged my fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities with the precision of a military strategist. He'd planned pranks targeting my job, my apartment, even my few close friendships, all designed to systematically destroy my confidence and independence. "Have you shown this to my parents?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. We tried. Their attorney advised them not to review any evidence or make any statements until they've had time to prepare their defense strategy. Their defense strategy. Even now, with incontrovertible proof of Danny's malicious intent spread across a hospital table, they were more concerned with legal protection than with acknowledging what had been done to me. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and Emma Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. My best friend since college looked exactly as I remembered, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and worry lines creasing her normally cheerful face. She'd driven 4 hours from Tucson the moment she received my call. "Jesus, Ivy," she breathed, taking in the medical equipment and my obvious condition. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better." I managed, grateful for the first genuinely supportive presence I'd felt in days. Emma pulled a chair close to my bed, her brown eyes filling with tears she tried to hide. "I saw the news coverage. They're calling it a prank gone wrong, but that detective who called me made it sound much more serious." Detective Foster introduced herself and briefly explained the scope of the investigation. As Emma listened to the evidence of premeditation and systematic planning, her expression shifted from sympathy to barely controlled rage. "You're telling me this was intentional? That little psychopath planned to paralyze his own sister?" "The evidence suggests he understood the potential for serious injury and proceeded anyway." Detective Foster confirmed. "Under Arizona law, that constitutes aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, even though he's a minor." Emma turned to me with the fierce protectiveness that had characterized our friendship for 8 years. "Ivy, please tell me you're pressing charges. Please tell me you're not going to let them convince you this was some kind of accident." The question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding since the investigation began. Part of me still felt guilty about the destruction my injury was bringing to the family, still heard Mom's voice calling me dramatic and attention-seeking. "I don't know," I admitted. "They're my family, Emma. Danny's just 16. I keep thinking maybe there's a way to handle this without destroying everyone's lives." Emma's response was swift and uncompromising. "Ivy, he destroyed your life. He researched how to paralyze you and then did it deliberately. That's not family dysfunction, that's criminal assault." Detective Foster leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Ivy, I understand this is difficult, but you need to know that this case will proceed regardless of your personal feelings. We have enough physical evidence and witness statements to prosecute without your cooperation, though your testimony would certainly strengthen the case." The weight of that knowledge settled over me like a heavy blanket. The legal system had taken control of the situation, removing the burden of choice that my family had always placed on my shoulders. "There's something else you should know," Detective Foster continued. "We've been in contact with the district attorney's office about potentially charging your parents as well." "My parents? But they weren't involved in the trampoline sabotage." "No, but they were present when it happened and failed to seek appropriate medical care despite obvious signs of serious injury. More importantly, Tyler Morrison's statement suggests they were aware of Danny's pattern of targeting you with increasingly dangerous pranks and not only failed to stop him, but actively encouraged his behavior." She pulled out another folder, this one containing witness statements from party guests. "Multiple attendees have come forward to describe your parents' reaction to your injury. Their immediate assumption that you were faking their resistance to calling emergency services their priority of protecting the party over your welfare. It all supports a pattern of negligent parenting that rises to the level of criminal child endangerment." Emma grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Ivy, do you remember when you called me last Christmas? You'd hurt your wrist and were in obvious pain, but your family accused you of ruining dinner by carrying on about it." I nodded, remembering the humiliation of being treated like a burden for needing medical attention. "You drove yourself to urgent care with what turned out to be 2 broken bones," Emma continued. You were 27 years old and still apologizing to me for bothering anyone about an injury that required a cast. The memory brought fresh perspective to what Detective Foster was describing. My family's treatment of my injuries hadn't been occasional oversight or differences of opinion about medical care. It had been a systematic pattern of neglect that had trained me to minimize my own pain and accept inadequate care as normal. "The district attorney wants to meet with you later this week," Detective Foster said. "Catherine Brooks is personally handling this case. She's prosecuted several high-profile family violence cases and has a particular interest in situations where parents enable abuse between siblings." Family violence. Another label I'd never applied to my childhood experiences, but one that seemed to fit with uncomfortable accuracy. A commotion in the hallway outside my room drew our attention. Raised voices and what sounded like an argument were growing louder, accompanied by the hurried footsteps of hospital security. Detective Foster stepped to the door, returning a moment later with a grim expression. "Your parents are here with their attorney. They're demanding to see you, claiming they have a right to visit their injured daughter." "Do they?" I asked, suddenly terrified at the prospect of facing them, armed with the knowledge of Danny's true intentions. "You're an adult, so you have complete control over your visitors," Detective Foster replied. "But I should warn you that anything they say in your presence could be used as evidence if they choose to discuss the case." Emma squeezed my hand supportively. "You don't have to see them if you're not ready." The offer of choice felt foreign after years of family obligation and guilt manipulation. For once, I could prioritize my own needs without worrying about disappointing anyone or causing family drama. "I think I need to see them," I said finally. "I need to understand what they're thinking, how they're processing what Danny did." Detective Foster nodded with professional understanding. "I'll be right outside if you need anything. Remember, you don't owe them explanations or forgiveness. You're the victim here, not the problem." As Emma helped me adjust my position in the hospital bed and Detective Foster stepped into the hallway, I braced myself for the first conversation with my parents since learning the truth about Danny's calculated cruelty. The scared, guilty daughter who had worried about ruining birthday parties was giving way to something harder and more determined. Whatever happened next, I would not allow them to minimize this injury or manipulate me into protecting Danny from consequences he'd earned through months of deliberate planning. For the first time in my life, the truth was documented, witnessed, and backed by legal authority that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. My parents entered the hospital room like actors taking the stage for a performance they'd rehearsed extensively. Dad wore his best khakis and a button-down shirt I'd only seen at church, while Mom clutched a bouquet of grocery store flowers that looked wilted despite their recent purchase. "Ivy, sweetheart." Mom said, her voice carrying the artificial warmth I remembered from childhood apologies. "We've been so worried about you." The endearment felt like sandpaper against my ears. She hadn't called me sweetheart since I was 12 years old, and only then when other people were listening. Dad positioned himself at the foot of my bed with the authoritative stance he'd used throughout my childhood to deliver lectures about responsibility and family loyalty. "We need to talk about this situation with Danny. Things have gotten completely out of hand." "You mean the situation where Danny deliberately sabotaged equipment to paralyze me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Ivy, you know that's not what happened. Danny made a mistake, yes, but calling it deliberate is just cruel. He's devastated about your accident." "It wasn't an accident, Mom. The police have evidence. Danny planned this for months." Dad's face flushed the familiar red that preceded his legendary temper explosions. "That's enough. I don't care what some detective claims to have found. Danny is a good boy who made an error in judgment. He doesn't deserve to have his life destroyed over teenage stupidity." The casual dismissal of evidence and my permanent disability as teenage stupidity crystallized something that had been building in my chest since the investigation began. For the first time in my life, I felt genuine anger toward my parents rather than hurt and confusion. "His life destroyed," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Dad, I will never walk again. Danny's life is going to continue just fine, while mine has been completely obliterated. Mom stepped forward with the placating gesture I remembered from countless childhood arguments. Honey, you're upset and in shock. The doctors said there might be hope for recovery if you work hard in physical therapy, but Danny's facing serious criminal charges that could ruin his future. There is no hope for recovery, I said flatly. My spinal cord was completely severed. That means permanent paralysis, and those criminal charges exist because Danny committed serious crimes. Dad's voice took on the threatening undertone that had controlled family dynamics for decades. Ivy, you're going to stop this nonsense right now. Family comes first, and that means protecting your brother from a legal system that wants to destroy young men for making mistakes. The familiar manipulation tactic might have worked on the scared child I'd been, but something fundamental had shifted in me during the past few days. The daughter who had spent years apologizing for taking up space was being replaced by a woman who refused to minimize attempted murder as a mistake. Get out, I said quietly. What? Mom asked, clearly not having heard what she expected. Get out of my room, both of you, right now. Dad's face went from red to purple. Young lady, you don't get to dismiss your parents when we're trying to have a reasonable conversation about family responsibility. I said, get out, I shouted loud enough to bring hospital staff running. Emma appeared in the doorway with Detective Foster close behind both women, taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Mom was crying into her wilted flowers, while Dad stood rigid with the kind of rage that had intimidated me throughout childhood. Is there a problem here? Detective Foster asked, her hand resting casually on the radio clipped to her belt. My daughter is having some kind of breakdown, Dad announced, as if my anger were a medical condition requiring intervention. She's not thinking clearly and needs family support, not legal interference. Detective Foster looked directly at me. Ivy, do you want your parents to leave? Yes, immediately. You heard her, Detective Foster said to my parents, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. This is private property and the patient has requested that you leave. If you don't go, voluntarily, hospital security will escort you out. Mom tried one last manipulation, turning to me with tears streaming down her face. Ivy, please don't let strangers turn you against your family. We love you and we're trying to protect everyone from this terrible situation. You're not protecting me, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion churning in my chest. You never have, and if you loved me, you would care more about my permanent disability than Danny's criminal charges. Dad started to respond, but Detective Foster stepped between him and my bed. Mr. Caldwell, you need to leave now. Any further contact with your daughter needs to go through your attorney. As my parents were escorted from the room, Mom turned back with one final attempt at guilt manipulation. He's your baby brother, Ivy. How can you destroy him like this? The words hung in the air after they left, encapsulating years of family dynamics that had taught me to prioritize everyone else's well-being over my own. But for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt about refusing to sacrifice myself for family peace. Emma closed the door and returned to my bedside with fierce protectiveness written across her features. I am so proud of you for standing up to them. That took incredible courage. I don't feel courageous, I admitted. I feel like I'm burning bridges I might need someday. Ivy, those bridges were built on quicksand, Emma said bluntly. A real family would be devastated about your injury and focused on your recovery, not pressuring you to protect your attacker from consequences. Detective Foster consulted her notes before speaking. I should inform you that your parents' visit here was likely coached by their attorney as an attempt to gauge your willingness to cooperate with their defense strategy. What do you mean? If they could convince you to minimize what happened or express forgiveness for Danny's actions, that could be used to undermine the prosecution's case. Your refusal to play that role actually strengthens our position considerably. The calculated nature of their visit made perfect sense in retrospect. Even my parents' emotional appeals had felt rehearsed, like lines from a script designed to manipulate rather than genuine expressions of concern. "There's something else I need to tell you," Detective Foster continued. "We received some interesting information from your Uncle Marcus this morning. He called our tip line with concerns about your family's financial situation." She pulled out a new folder, this one containing financial documents that meant nothing to my untrained eye. "According to your uncle, there's a trust fund that was established for you by your grandmother before she died. Your parents have been managing it since you turned 18, but they've never mentioned its existence to you." A trust fund. The revelation hit me like cold water, bringing back memories of overheard conversations about Grandma Ruth's will and Dad's mysterious improvement in family finances around the time I graduated high school. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. Detective Foster consulted the documents. According to the bank records we subpoenaed, the original trust was worth approximately $150,000 when it was established 8 years ago. With interest and investment growth, it should be worth significantly more now. $150,000. Money that could have paid for my college education without student loans helped me buy a house, instead of renting a studio apartment, provided the financial security I'd struggled to build throughout my 20s. "But here's where it gets interesting," Detective Foster continued. "Your uncle provided bank statements showing regular withdrawals from the trust account over the past several years, supposedly for your benefit. However, the money appears to have been used for Danny's expenses, including his new phone sports equipment and a college fund your parents established in his name. Trust fund theft." The phrase echoed in my head as the full scope of my family's betrayal became clear. Not only had they enabled Danny's systematic abuse, they had stolen my financial independence to fund his privileged lifestyle. Emma's reaction was swift and furious. "They've been stealing from you for years while watching you struggle to pay rent and student loans. That's beyond family dysfunction. That's criminal fraud. Your uncle seems to think the total amount stolen could exceed $300,000 when you factor in lost investment income," Detective Foster said. "He's been suspicious about your parents' sudden improvement in lifestyle and Danny's expensive possessions, but he didn't feel comfortable confronting his brother without proof." $300,000. The number was large enough to change everything about my future prospects, especially now that I face the enormous expenses associated with adaptive equipment and accessible housing. "What can we do about this?" I asked. "We've already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Trust fund fraud falls under federal jurisdiction, which means additional charges beyond the state-level assault case. Your parents are looking at potential federal prison time if they're convicted." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A man in his 50s appeared wearing a hospital volunteer badge and pushing a cart filled with books and magazines. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I'm Father Miguel from the hospital chaplaincy program. I heard you might appreciate a visit." Emma looked to me for guidance, and I nodded. After the emotional confrontation with my parents, the presence of someone whose job involved providing comfort rather than gathering evidence seemed appealing. Father Miguel had the kind of gentle manner that suggested years of experience with crisis situations. His graying hair and lined face spoke of wisdom earned through accompanying people through their worst moments. "I don't want to intrude," he said, settling into the visitor's chair with practiced ease, "but I understand you're dealing with some very difficult family circumstances on top of a serious injury." "That's one way to put it," I said, surprised by the relief I felt at talking to someone who wasn't collecting evidence or building legal cases. "Family betrayal often hurts worse than physical trauma," Father Miguel observed. "When the people who are supposed to protect us become the source of our pain, it challenges everything we thought we knew about love and safety." His words captured something I'd been struggling to articulate since learning about Danny's deliberate planning. The spinal injury was devastating, but the knowledge that my own family had enabled and funded years of systematic abuse felt like a deeper violation. "I keep thinking I should feel more anger," I admitted. but mostly I just feel sad and confused. Grief for the family you thought you had is completely normal, Father Miguel said. You're mourning not just your physical capabilities, but also the illusion of parental love and protection that's been stripped away. As Detective Foster gathered her evidence folders and prepared to leave, she turned back with one final piece of information. Ivy, there's going to be a lot of media attention over the next few weeks. The story of deliberate sibling assault combined with parental financial fraud is exactly the kind of case that captures public interest. You might want to consider hiring your own attorney to protect your interests separate from the criminal prosecution. The suggestion of media attention sent a chill through me. I'd spent years trying to avoid being the center of family drama, and now my most private trauma was about to become public entertainment. But as I looked around the hospital room at Emma's supportive presence and Father Miguel's compassionate understanding, I realized that the truth coming to light might be exactly what I needed to finally break free from the family patterns that had defined my life. For the first time since lying motionless on that concrete patio, I felt something that might have been hope. Tuesday brought District Attorney Catherine Brooks to my hospital room, and with her the full weight of the legal system's response to what had been done to me. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing as they took in my condition and the evidence spread across my bedside table. "Miss Caldwell, I'm going to be direct with you," she said, settling into the chair that had become a revolving seat for law enforcement officials. "This case has elements that make it particularly serious under Arizona law. We're not just talking about a teenage prank gone wrong anymore." She opened a briefcase that seemed to contain the entire documented history of my family's dysfunction. "Your brother is facing charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, which carries a potential sentence of 5 to 15 years in adult prison. Given the premeditation and severity of the outcome, my office is prepared to try him as an adult." Adult prison. The phrase sent ice through my veins as I thought about 16-year-old Danny facing the reality of violent criminals and hardened offenders. But the recording your friend helped you make has opened up an entirely new dimension to this case. D.A. Brooks continued producing a small digital recorder I recognized as Emma's. "When your mother attempted to bribe you into dropping charges, she committed the federal crime of witness tampering. I'd almost forgotten about Mom's desperate visit the day before when she'd offered me $20,000 from Danny's college fund to let this go quietly." Emma had been quick thinking enough to record the conversation on her phone, thinking it might be relevant to the investigation. "Witness tampering is a felony that carries up to 20 years in federal prison," D.A. Brooks explained. "Combined with the trust fund fraud, Detective Foster discovered your parents are facing serious federal charges, in addition to state-level child endangerment accusations." The scope of the legal consequences was becoming overwhelming. What had started as a backyard accident was metastasizing into a complex criminal case that could destroy multiple lives. "I need you to understand something," D.A. Brooks said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with reluctant witnesses. "This prosecution will proceed regardless of your personal feelings about your family. We have sufficient evidence to convict without your cooperation, though your testimony would certainly strengthen our case." "What if I don't want to testify?" I asked, imagining the trauma of facing Danny and my parents in a courtroom while describing years of abuse and neglect. "That's your choice as the victim, but I want you to consider something. Your brother researched spinal injuries before carrying out this assault. He knew he might paralyze you and proceeded anyway. That's not teenage stupidity, that's attempted murder." Attempted murder. The words hung in the sterile hospital air like a physical presence. If we don't prosecute this case to the full extent of the law, we send a message that family violence is somehow less serious than violence between strangers. Your brother could easily target someone else in the future if he doesn't face real consequences for his actions. The argument was compelling, especially when I considered Tyler Morrison's statement about previous pranks and Danny's notebook full of plans for escalating harassment. This hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that would likely continue without intervention. "There's something else you should know," DA Brooks said, pulling out yet another folder. "We've been contacted by the disability rights organization that's been following your case. They want to offer you a position as a spokesperson for family violence survivors with disabilities." The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. I'd been focused on adjusting to basic functions like transferring from bed to wheelchair, and the idea of becoming a public advocate seemed impossibly ambitious. "You don't have to decide immediately," DA Brooks said, recognizing my uncertainty. "But I wanted you to know there are people who see your case as an opportunity to bring attention to a type of abuse that often goes unrecognized." Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway that was becoming disturbingly familiar. Raised voices and hurried footsteps suggested another confrontation involving my family, and Detective Foster's voice could be heard giving firm instructions to someone. "What now?" I asked, though part of me already knew. DA Brooks stepped to the door and returned with an expression mixing frustration and grim satisfaction. "Your father was just arrested at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport attempting to board a flight to Mexico with $50,000 in cash and identification documents that appear to be falsified." The news hit me like a physical blow. Dad had tried to run rather than face the consequences of what his family had done to me. Attempted flight from prosecution is a federal crime that substantially increases his potential sentence, DA Brooks explained. It also suggests consciousness of guilt that will be very damaging to his defense. Emma arrived just as DA Brooks was packing up her briefcase, and the two women exchanged the kind of meaningful look that suggested they'd already spoken about my situation. "How are you holding up?" Emma asked, settling into her now customary chair beside my bed. "I feel like I'm drowning in legal terminology and criminal charges," I admitted. "This morning I was Ivy, the marketing coordinator with a difficult family. Now I'm Ivy, the attempted murder victim whose father is a fleeing felon. You're also Ivy, the survivor who's finally going to get justice," Emma said firmly, "and Ivy, the woman who recorded her mother trying to bribe her way out of accountability." The reminder of the recording brought back the moment when Mom had offered me money to protect Danny from his crimes. The casual assumption that I could be bought off with funds stolen from my own trust account seemed especially grotesque in retrospect. "Emma, can I ask you something honestly?" I said. "Always." "Do you think I'm doing the right thing by cooperating with this prosecution? Or am I destroying lives out of anger and hurt feelings?" Emma's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Ivy, you didn't start this destruction. Danny did when he spent months planning to paralyze you. Your parents did when they enabled his abuse and stole your money for years. You're not destroying lives, you're finally refusing to protect people who never protected you." Her words echoed something Father Miguel had said during his visit the day before about the difference between forgiveness and enabling continued harm. Real love sometimes required holding people accountable for their actions, even when accountability was painful. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice taking on the conspiratorial tone she used when sharing important news. "I've been doing some research on adaptive sports programs, and there's a Paralympic training facility in Colorado that specializes in working with new spinal cord injury patients." The change of subject was welcome relief from legal discussions. "What kind of sports?" "Wheelchair racing, basketball, tennis, even skiing. They have athletes who compete at the international level, and they offer training programs for people who want to get serious about competitive sports." The idea of athletic competition seemed impossible from my current position in a hospital bed, but Emma's enthusiasm was infectious. Throughout college, she'd been the friend who pushed me out of my comfort zone and into new experiences. "The application deadline for their summer intensive program is next month," she continued. "I know it seems early to be thinking about things like that, but having goals might help with the adjustment process." "Goals." The concept felt foreign after days of focusing on medical terminology and legal proceedings, but the idea of working towards something positive rather than just processing trauma had obvious appeal. "I'll think about it," I said, meaning it. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Martinez, who carried test results and wore the expression of someone delivering complex news. "Ivy, your latest scans show that your neurological condition has stabilized," she began. "There's no additional swelling or complications, which means we can begin planning your discharge and transition to rehabilitation services." Discharge. The word brought a mixture of relief and terror. The hospital had become a protective cocoon where medical staff managed every aspect of my care. The prospect of navigating the real world as a paralyzed person seemed overwhelming. "How long before I can go home?" I asked. "That depends on several factors," Dr. Martinez replied. "First, we need to ensure you have appropriate housing arrangements. Your current apartment isn't accessible for wheelchair use, so you'll need to make alternative living arrangements." The practical implications of my injury were beginning to penetrate beyond medical care. My studio apartment was on the second floor with no elevator, and the bathroom was too small for wheelchair access. Even if I could return to work, I'd need to find a new place to live. Second, you'll need several weeks of intensive rehabilitation to learn basic skills for independent living. Things like transfers, wheelchair navigation, adaptive driving, and home management skills. Independent living. The phrase carried both promise and daunting responsibility. "The good news is that your insurance should cover most rehabilitation costs," Dr. Martinez continued. "And once the legal matters involving your trust fund are resolved, you should have financial resources to make necessary adaptations to your living situation." Financial resources. The stolen money that was finally being recovered represented more than just compensation for past theft. It offered the possibility of real independence for the first time in my adult life. As Dr. Martinez left to arrange rehabilitation consultations and Emma began researching accessible housing options on her laptop, I found myself contemplating a future that looked completely different from anything I'd imagined a week ago. The woman who had driven to a birthday party worrying about family obligations was gone forever. In her place was someone who would need to rebuild every aspect of her life from the ground up, but who would do so with the support of real advocates and the resources that should have been available to me years ago. For the first time since lying motionless on that concrete patio, the future seemed to hold possibilities beyond just survival. The phone call came at 3 a.m. on Wednesday, jarring me from the restless sleep that had become my norm since the accident. Detective Foster's voice carried an urgency that cut through my medication haze and brought me to full alertness immediately. "Ivy, I'm at Phoenix Children's Hospital with your brother. He attempted suicide last night and was found by your uncle Marcus. He's stable now, but he's asking to speak with you." Suicide attempt. The words crashed over me like ice water, bringing guilt and confusion in equal measure. Despite everything Danny had done, despite the evidence of his calculated cruelty, he was still my 16-year-old brother, who had apparently reached a breaking point. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He overdosed on prescription anxiety medication your parents had given him to help deal with the stress of the criminal charges. If your uncle hadn't decided to check on him when he did, we might be having a very different conversation right now." Uncle Marcus. The only family member who had consistently shown genuine concern for my welfare was now dealing with the aftermath of Danny's desperate attempt to escape consequences. "He's been placed on a psychiatric hold for evaluation, but he's been asking for you repeatedly. His psychiatrist thinks speaking with you might be therapeutic for both of you, but the decision is completely yours." The request put me in an impossible position. Part of me wanted to see Danny to understand how the boy I'd grown up with had become someone capable of researching how to paralyze his sister. But another part of me recoiled from the idea of providing comfort to my attacker, even if he was also a victim of our family's dysfunction. "I'll come," I heard myself saying, "but I want Emma there, and I want Detective Foster present for any conversation." "Understood. I'll arrange transport and make sure the medical staff know you're coming." 2 hours later, I found myself in another hospital room, this one equipped with psychiatric monitoring equipment and staffed by nurses trained in mental health crisis management. Danny looked smaller than I remembered, 16 years old and fragile, in a way that reminded me of the little boy who used to have nightmares about monsters under his bed. But when he opened his eyes and saw me, what came out wasn't the remorse or apology I'd expected. Instead, it was a torrent of confession that revealed the full scope of what our parents had done to both of us. "They told me you deserved it," he said, his voice hoarse from the medications they'd given him. "From the time I was little, they told me you were ungrateful and dramatic, and that someone needed to teach you lessons about humility." The words hit me like physical blows, confirming suspicions I'd carried for years about the family dynamics that had shaped our childhood. "They said you thought you were better than us because you got good grades and went to college." Danny continued, tears streaming down his face. "Dad told me that putting you in your place was part of being a good brother." Dr. Kevin Ross, the psychiatrist assigned to Danny's case, took notes quietly in the corner, while Detective Foster recorded everything for the ongoing investigation. But I found myself focused entirely on my brother's words, trying to understand how parental manipulation had created a child capable of planning to paralyze his sibling. "When did they start encouraging you to hurt me?" I asked, surprised by my own clinical detachment. "I don't know exactly. It feels like it was always part of how things worked. When you cried about getting hurt, they'd roll their eyes and tell me you were being dramatic. When you succeeded at something, they'd find ways to diminish it and tell me I needed to make sure you didn't get too full of yourself." The systematic nature of the psychological manipulation was becoming clear. My parents hadn't just failed to protect me from Danny's abuse, they had actively cultivated it as part of their parenting strategy. The pranks started small. Danny continued his words, tumbling over each other in urgent confession. "Hiding your homework, putting salt in your water bottle, loosening the screws on your desk chair. Every time you got upset, Mom and Dad would praise me for keeping you grounded." I remembered those incidents filed away in my memory as typical sibling rivalry rather than deliberate harassment encouraged by our parents. The pattern of minimizing my pain and rewarding Danny's cruelty had been so consistent that I'd accepted it as normal family dynamics. "But it got worse when you moved out and started doing well at your job," Danny said. "Dad was angry that you were succeeding without family help, and Mom kept saying you needed to be brought down a peg or two. They started asking me specifically what I was doing to remind you of your place in the family hierarchy." Dr. Ross looked up from his notes with professional concern. "Danny, can you be more specific about what your parents said regarding your sister's success?" "They called it the Ivy problem," Danny replied, using air quotes with shaking hands. "Dad said successful women become arrogant and forget where they come from. He told me it was my job as her little brother to make sure she never forgot she was still just Ivy from the Caldwell family." The Ivy problem. The phrase encapsulated years of subtle undermining and deliberate sabotage that I'd attributed to my own oversensitivity or misunderstanding of family affection. The trampoline thing wasn't my idea, originally. Danny continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Dad suggested it after I told him you'd probably try to show off your old gymnastic skills at the party. He said it would be funny if you fell on your ass in front of everyone." Detective Foster leaned forward with sharp attention. "Danny, are you saying your father specifically suggested sabotaging the trampoline?" "He didn't tell me exactly how to do it, but he said accidents happen when people get overconfident on equipment they haven't used in years." Then he winked at me like we shared a secret. The implication was staggering. If Danny's account was accurate, Dad hadn't just enabled the assault, he had actively suggested it, while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific mechanics. "Why didn't you tell the police this earlier?" Emma asked, speaking for the first time since we'd entered the room. Danny's response revealed the depth of psychological manipulation he'd endured. "Because I thought I'd get in more trouble for blaming them. They always taught me that taking responsibility meant not making excuses or pointing fingers at other people. The twisted logic made perfect sense within the context of our family's dysfunction. Even facing criminal charges, Danny had been conditioned to protect our parents at his own expense. Dr. Ross set down his pen and addressed Danny directly. "Have you told your parents about your suicidal thoughts or your feelings of guilt about what happened to your sister?" "I tried to," Danny said, fresh tears beginning to flow. "But Mom said I needed to stop wallowing in self-pity and focus on defending myself against false accusations. Dad said real men don't break down when facing adversity." Even during their son's mental health crisis, my parents had prioritized legal strategy over emotional support. The pattern of emotional neglect and manipulation extended far beyond their treatment of me. "Danny, there's something I need to tell you," I said, surprised by the compassion I felt for the boy who had destroyed my life. "What happened to me wasn't your fault alone. You were a child being manipulated by adults who should have protected both of us." His reaction was immediate and intense. "But I'm the one who loosened the bolts. I'm the one who researched how to make you fall. I'm the one who wanted to see you get hurt." "You're also the one who was systematically trained from childhood to see hurting me as a good thing," I replied. "That doesn't excuse what you did, but it explains why you were capable of doing it." Dr. Ross nodded approvingly at my response. "Danny, recognizing the manipulation you experienced doesn't eliminate your responsibility for your actions, but it's an important step in understanding how you became someone capable of planning to harm your sister." The conversation continued for another hour, revealing layer after layer of psychological abuse that had shaped both our childhoods. Danny described being praised for aggressive behavior toward me, while being punished for showing me affection or protection. He'd been explicitly taught that my pain was entertaining and that causing it was a way to earn parental approval. By the time we prepared to leave, Danny had provided enough information to fundamentally change the criminal case against our parents. His testimony about Dad's specific suggestion regarding the trampoline and Mom's coaching about hiding their involvement could result in conspiracy charges that carried decades in prison. "I'm sorry," Danny said as Emma helped position my wheelchair for departure. "I know that's not enough, and I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm genuinely sorry for what I did to you." The apology felt more authentic than anything I'd heard from my parents since the accident. Whatever Danny had become under their influence, there was still enough of the real person left to recognize the magnitude of what had been lost. "I accept your apology," I said, meaning it. "But Danny, you need to testify about what Mom and Dad taught you. Other families need to see what this kind of manipulation can lead to." He nodded with the exhausted resignation of someone who had finally stopped carrying secrets that were too heavy for a child to bear. As we left the psychiatric ward, Detective Foster confirmed what I'd already suspected. Danny's revelations had provided the missing pieces needed to file conspiracy charges against our parents. The case was no longer just about parental negligence, but about active participation in planning an assault that had permanently disabled their daughter. The damaged teenager in that hospital bed was both my attacker and my fellow victim, a distinction that would complicate my feelings for years to come, but didn't change the fundamental truth that justice required exposing the adults who had created him. Thursday morning brought attorney Lisa Chen to my hospital bedside, and with her revelations about my family's financial crimes that made the physical assault seem almost simple by comparison. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who specialized in financial fraud cases and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen every type of family betrayal imaginable. "Miss Caldwell, what I'm about to show you will probably be upsetting." She began opening a briefcase filled with bank statements and legal documents. "Your Uncle Marcus was correct about the trust fund theft, but the situation is significantly worse than we initially suspected." She spread the papers across my bedside table like pieces of a puzzle that would reveal the true scope of my parents' deception. The numbers and account details meant nothing to me initially, but as she walked through each document, A picture of systematic financial abuse emerged that was breathtaking in its audacity. Your grandmother Ruth established this trust fund with an initial deposit of $300,000, not the $150,000 we first reported, Lisa explained. The money was specifically designated for your education, housing, and future security, with very clear restrictions on how it could be used. $300,000. The number was large enough to represent complete financial independence, the kind of security that could have eliminated the stress and struggle that had defined my adult life. But here's where it gets interesting. Lisa continued pulling out a thick folder of bank statements. Over the past 8 years, your parents have systematically withdrawn funds for expenses that had nothing to do with your welfare. Danny's private school tuition, family vacations to Europe, a new truck for your father, renovations, to the family home, even Mom's cosmetic surgery. The list of expenditures read like a catalog of the lifestyle improvements I'd watched my family enjoy while I struggled to pay student loans and rent. Every success they'd celebrated had been funded with money intended to secure my future. The total amount stolen exceeds $400,000 when you include lost investment income. Lisa said, her voice carrying the outrage of someone who had spent her career fighting financial predators. Your parents essentially used your inheritance as their personal bank account while watching you live paycheck to paycheck. $400,000. The scope of the theft was overwhelming, representing not just money, but years of financial anxiety that could have been avoided entirely. How is this legal? I asked, struggling to understand how such obvious theft could occur without detection. Technically, it wasn't legal, but trust fund abuse by family members is unfortunately common and difficult to prosecute, Lisa explained. Your parents were named as trustees, which gave them legal access to the accounts. The fraud lies in their misrepresentation of how the money was being spent. She pulled out copies of forms my parents had filed with the bank, documenting their justifications for each withdrawal. The creative accounting was stunning in its dishonesty. They claimed your college tuition was $30,000 per year, when your actual costs were covered by scholarships and grants, Lisa pointed out. They said they were paying for your apartment when you've been living independently and paying your own rent. They even claimed medical expenses for treatments you never received. Each lie built upon previous deceptions, creating a financial house of cards that had funded my family's comfortable lifestyle, while I believed I was struggling due to my own inadequacy and poor financial management. The most disturbing part, Lisa continued, is that they established a college fund for Danny using money stolen from your trust. He's been accepted to Arizona State with what he believes is a merit-based scholarship fund, but it's actually your grandmother's money that was always intended for you. The emotional impact of that revelation was devastating. Not only had they stolen my financial security, they'd used it to give Danny opportunities while allowing me to believe I'd failed to earn similar advantages through my own efforts. What can we do about this? I asked, though part of me was afraid the theft was too old and complex to remedy. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is treating this as a federal case because it involves trust fund fraud across state lines, Lisa replied. Your grandmother's estate was probated in California, and the stolen funds were moved through multiple accounts in different states to obscure the paper trail. She showed me a chart that tracked the money's movement from the original trust account through a series of family-controlled accounts, each transfer designed to make the trail more difficult to follow. Additionally, we're filing civil lawsuits to recover the stolen funds plus interest and punitive damages. Your parents' assets will be frozen pending resolution of the criminal charges and will be seeking complete restitution. The prospect of financial justice was gratifying, but it couldn't restore the years of unnecessary stress and limitation I'd endured while my family lived comfortably on money intended for my security. There's one more thing you should know, Lisa said, pulling out a final document that looked different from the bank statements and legal filings. Your grandmother's original will contain provisions that your parents never told you about. The will was written in the formal language of legal documents, but Lisa translated the relevant sections into plain English that revealed yet another layer of family deception. In addition to the trust fund, you were supposed to inherit a rental property in Sedona that's been generating income for the past 8 years, she explained. The property is currently worth approximately $200,000, and it's been producing rental income of about $1,500 per month. A rental property generating passive income while I'd worked overtime to afford my studio apartment. The systematic nature of what my parents had hidden from me was becoming clear, and with it, the realization that my entire adult life had been built on a foundation of lies. The rental income has been going into an account your parents control, supposedly for property maintenance and taxes, Lisa continued. But the actual maintenance costs have been minimal, and they've been using the income as additional discretionary funds. The numbers were adding up to a level of financial security that would have eliminated every source of stress and anxiety that had defined my 20s. I could have owned property-built savings, perhaps even started my own business instead of struggling to establish myself in someone else's company. When will I have access to these funds? I asked, trying to process the enormity of what had been stolen from me. The criminal restitution should be available within 6 months, assuming your parents are convicted, Lisa replied. The civil recovery may take longer, but we should be able to secure interim access to some funds for your immediate medical and housing needs. As she packed up her briefcase and prepared to leave, Lisa handed me a business card and a folder containing copies of all the financial documents we'd reviewed. Ivy, I want you to understand something, she said, her voice carrying the weight of professional experience. What your parents did goes far beyond typical family financial disputes. This was systematic theft designed to keep you dependent and struggling while they lived comfortably on resources that were rightfully yours. The validation of my suspicions felt both gratifying and heartbreaking. Years of wondering why financial success seemed so elusive suddenly made sense when viewed through the lens of deliberate sabotage. Emma, who had listened to the entire presentation with growing outrage, waited until Lisa left before expressing what I was thinking. They didn't just enable Danny's assault on you, she said, her voice shaking with anger. They spent years stealing your financial independence to fund their lifestyle and his advantages. This wasn't just criminal, it was evil. The word evil felt appropriate for the systematic nature of what had been done to me. Every struggle I'd faced, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment of financial anxiety had been unnecessary, manufactured by people who were supposed to ensure my welfare and security. But as devastating as these revelations were, they also represented something I'd never had before: the prospect of genuine financial independence and the resources needed to build whatever life I chose for myself moving forward. The woman who had driven to a birthday party worrying about gas money would never exist again. In her place was someone who would have the resources to adapt to disability with dignity, to pursue goals that had seemed impossible, and to help other survivors without worrying about her own basic needs. For the first time since the accident, I felt something that might have been excitement about the future. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my hospital room, a woman in her 30s with short auburn hair and the kind of confident energy that filled whatever space she occupied. She introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell from the Disability Rights Alliance, and she carried news that would transform my understanding of what my future might hold. Ivy, your story has resonated with disability advocates across the country, she said, settling into the chair that had become a revolving seat for the parade of officials investigating my case. We've been following the legal proceedings, and we'd like to offer you an opportunity to turn your experience into advocacy for other survivors. The suggestion felt surreal. A week ago, I'd been focused on managing my marketing clients and avoiding family drama. Now someone was suggesting I could become a voice for disability rights on a national level. What exactly would that involve? I asked, curious despite my uncertainty. Sarah opened a folder containing newspaper clippings and online articles that showed my story had spread far beyond local Phoenix news coverage. Headlines like, Family betrayal leaves sister paralyzed, and trust fund theft funds teens assault planning stared back at me from publications I'd never heard of. The combination of deliberate family violence and financial abuse has captured national attention, Sarah explained. But more importantly, it's highlighting gaps in how we protect disabled abuse survivors. Your case could help change legislation and improve support systems for others in similar situations. She showed me letters from other survivors, people who had experienced family violence that resulted in disabilities or who had discovered financial abuse after becoming dependent on family care. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine, suggesting patterns of exploitation that were more common than I'd realized. We're prepared to offer you a position as our national spokesperson for family violence survivors with disabilities, Sarah continued. The role would involve speaking at conferences, working with legislators on policy reform, and helping develop support resources for other survivors. The opportunity was both appealing and terrifying. Speaking publicly about the most traumatic experience of my life seemed overwhelming, but the possibility of preventing other families from experiencing similar betrayal was compelling. I'd need to think about it, I said, overwhelmed by the scope of what she was proposing. Of course, but I should mention that we're prepared to offer a salary that would provide complete financial independence, plus travel allowances and support staff to help manage your advocacy work. Financial independence through meaningful work rather than just lawsuit settlements. The concept represented a type of purpose I'd never considered possible in my pre-injury life. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Martinez, who carried discharge papers and wore the satisfied expression of someone delivering good news. Ivy, your medical condition has stabilized to the point where we can transfer you to the rehabilitation hospital next week, she announced. You'll spend about 6 weeks there learning independent living skills and adaptive techniques. 6 weeks felt like an eternity and an impossibly short time simultaneously. Learning to rebuild my entire life from scratch would apparently happen on a compressed timeline that seemed both urgent and insufficient. Additionally, Dr. Martinez continued, I've been contacted by the Paralympic Training Center in Colorado that your friend Emma mentioned. They're offering you a spot in their summer intensive program if you're interested in pursuing competitive athletics. Paralympic training. The idea still seemed impossible from my current position, but Emma's research had shown me videos of wheelchair racers who moved with a grace and speed that made my own limitations seem less permanent. The program is specifically designed for new spinal cord injury patients who show aptitude for athletic training, Dr. Martinez explained. They have a remarkable success rate in helping people transition from rehabilitation to competitive sports. Before I could respond, Emma burst through the door with her laptop and an expression of barely contained excitement. Ivy, you need to see this, she said, setting up her computer on the bedside table. The story about your case has gone viral on social media, and the response has been incredible. The screen showed a hashtag trending on multiple platforms, Justice for Ivy. Thousands of people were sharing my story, offering support and demanding accountability for family violence against disabled individuals. Look at this, Emma said, scrolling through comments that ranged from personal stories of similar abuse to offers of financial support and advocacy assistance. People are organizing fundraisers, sharing resources for other survivors, and pressuring legislators to strengthen protections for disabled abuse victims. The outpouring of support was overwhelming and humbling. Strangers were investing emotional energy and resources in seeking justice for someone they'd never met, simply because my story had touched something universal about the vulnerability of family betrayal. There's more. Emma continued clicking to a news video from a national morning show. They want to interview you about the case and the broader issues it raises about family violence and disability rights. The prospect of television interviews added another layer of surreal complexity to my situation. The private trauma I'd spent years hiding was becoming public advocacy material that could potentially help others. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat to regain our attention. Ivy, while all these opportunities are exciting, I want to remind you that you're still in the early stages of adapting to a major life change. It's important not to take on too much too quickly. Her caution was medically sound, but part of me felt energized by having concrete goals that extended beyond just learning to navigate daily tasks as a paralyzed person. What if I started small? I suggested. Maybe one interview to test the waters and see how it feels to talk publicly about what happened. Sarah from the Disability Rights Alliance leaned forward with interest. That's exactly the right approach. We could arrange for a single interview with a reporter who specializes in disability issues, someone who would handle your story with appropriate sensitivity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Uncle Marcus, who looked haggard but carried himself with the determination of someone who had made difficult decisions. He'd been dealing with Danny's psychiatric hospitalization while also managing the fallout from Dad's arrest and Mom's mounting legal troubles. Ivy, I wanted you to know that I've filed for emergency custody of Danny, he announced without preamble. His psychiatrist believes he needs stable housing with family members who aren't facing criminal charges. The news brought relief mixed with concern for both Danny and Uncle Marcus, who was essentially adopting a traumatized teenager, while his brother faced federal prison time. How is he doing? I asked, surprised by my continued concern for the brother who had destroyed my life. Better since he started talking honestly about what your parents taught him, Uncle Marcus replied. Dr. Ross thinks he has a good chance of recovery if he's removed from their influence permanently. He pulled up a chair and looked directly at me with an expression mixing family loyalty and moral clarity that I'd rarely seen from Caldwell relatives. Ivy, I need you to know that I'm going to testify for the prosecution in your parents' trial, he said. I've suspected for years that they were stealing from your trust fund and enabling Danny's behavior toward you. I should have spoken up sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't. The apology from a family member felt foreign but deeply appreciated. Uncle Marcus represented the possibility that some Caldwell family relationships could survive the destruction of others. What will happen to Danny long term? I asked. If the juvenile court accepts the psychiatrist's recommendations, he'll likely receive counseling and community service rather than incarceration, Uncle Marcus explained. But part of his rehabilitation plan involves making amends to you in whatever way you're comfortable accepting. Making amends. The concept suggested possibilities for healing that seemed impossibly optimistic given the current circumstances. As the afternoon progressed and various visitors shared information about legal proceedings, advocacy opportunities, and rehabilitation plans, I found myself contemplating a future that looked nothing like anything I'd imagined, but held promise in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The marketing coordinator who had driven to a birthday party would never exist again. But in her place was emerging someone with the resources, support systems, and platform needed to ensure other families couldn't destroy their children with the systematic cruelty that had defined my upbringing. For the first time since lying motionless on that concrete patio, I felt genuinely excited about what might come next. Monday morning brought news that would fundamentally change the scope of the criminal case against my parents. Detective Foster arrived at the rehabilitation hospital where I'd been transferred carrying evidence bags and wearing the expression of someone who had uncovered something significant. Ivy, we executed a second search warrant on your parents' house over the weekend. She began settling into one of the therapy room chairs where I'd been practicing wheelchair transfers. What we found suggests this case goes much deeper than we originally suspected. She opened her laptop to show me photographs of documents recovered from Dad's home office, hidden in a safe that had required FBI specialists to open. The papers revealed a level of financial planning that made the trust fund theft seem almost accidental by comparison. Your father has been systematically documenting what he calls Ivy management strategies for the past 5 years. Detective Foster explained, showing me handwritten notes in Dad's familiar scrawl. These aren't just records of the money he stole from your trust fund. They're detailed plans for keeping you financially dependent and emotionally isolated. The documents were chilling in their clinical approach to controlling my life. Dad had tracked my income expenses and social relationships with the thoroughness of a surveillance operation. He'd noted when I seemed too confident or successful, followed by strategies for correcting my attitude through family manipulation or Danny's increasingly aggressive pranks. "Look at this entry from last year," Detective Foster said, pointing to a particularly disturbing passage. "Your father wrote about your promotion at work being problematic because it made you less reliant on family approval. He specifically planned Danny's escalating harassment campaign to undermine your self-confidence." The systematic nature of their manipulation was breathtaking. Every family interaction I'd attributed to normal dysfunction had apparently been carefully orchestrated to maintain control over my emotional and financial independence. "But here's the most damaging evidence." Detective Foster continued, pulling up a different document. "We found detailed research your father conducted about spinal injuries and their long-term effects. This was done 2 weeks before the birthday party." 2 weeks before. The timing meant Dad had been researching paralysis before Danny ever loosened the trampoline bolts, suggesting a level of premeditation that elevated the charges to attempted murder. The research includes information about permanent disability benefits, medical costs, and legal guardianship procedures for incapacitated adults, Detective Foster explained. "Your father was apparently planning for the possibility that you would be seriously injured and exploring how to maintain financial control even if you became disabled." The implications were staggering. Not only had my family planned the assault, they had researched how to exploit my resulting disability for their continued financial benefit. "This evidence changes everything about the criminal case," Detective Foster said. "The district attorney is now prepared to charge your father with conspiracy to commit attempted murder, not just assault. Your mother faces charges for financial conspiracy and witness tampering." Conspiracy to commit attempted murder. The phrase felt surreal, like something from a crime drama, rather than a description of my family's behavior. "What about Danny?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "His cooperation in exposing your parents' planning has been crucial for building the case," Detective Foster replied. "The juvenile court is likely to accept a plea agreement that involves intensive counseling and community service provided he continues testifying truthfully about the family dynamics." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my physical therapist, Jessica Turner, an energetic woman in her 40s who had been teaching me the basics of wheelchair navigation and transfer techniques. "Sorry to interrupt," Jessica said, "but Ivy has an important visitor. Someone from the Paralympic Training Center is here to evaluate her potential for competitive athletics." The visitor turned out to be Marcus Rodriguez, a former Paralympic gold medalist who now coached new athletes at the Colorado training facility. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with his racing wheelchair, and his presence filled the therapy room with quiet confidence. "Ivy, I've been following your case in the news," he said, settling his chair beside mine with practiced ease. "But I'm here to talk about your future, not your past. Dr. Martinez sent me your medical records, and your physical condition suggests excellent potential for competitive racing." The idea of athletic competition still seemed impossible, but Marcus's matter-of-fact approach made it feel more realistic than abstract possibility. "We have athletes who started training months after their injuries and went on to set world records," he continued. "The key is starting with proper technique and building endurance systematically." He explained the training program structure, which involves 6 months of intensive coaching, followed by qualification competitions that could lead to national team selection. The commitment was substantial, but it offered the kind of concrete goals that had been missing from my rehabilitation planning. "I should mention that we've been contacted by several sponsors who are interested in supporting your training," Marcus added. "Your story has resonated with companies that want to demonstrate their commitment to disability athletics." Sponsorship deals for athletic training felt like science fiction, but Marcus showed me examples of other athletes who had built careers through competitive wheelchair racing. The financial independence was appealing, but the prospect of channeling my recovery energy into physical achievement was even more compelling. Our discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside the therapy room. Raised voices and the sound of hospital security suggested another unwanted family confrontation. What now? I asked, though recent experience had taught me to expect the worst from any unannounced family contact. Detective Foster stepped into the hallway and returned with information that confirmed my suspicions. Your father's attorney is here with your mother. They're demanding to speak with you about your testimony plans for the upcoming trial. The prospect of facing my parents again felt overwhelming, especially armed with knowledge of Dad's systematic planning documents and research into exploiting my disability. You don't have to see them, Jessica said firmly. This is a medical facility and your recovery takes priority over legal maneuvering. But part of me wanted to confront them with the evidence of their calculated cruelty to see how they would justify years of systematic manipulation and the planning that had led to my permanent disability. I'll see them, I decided. But I want Detective Foster present and I want everything recorded. Emma arrived as we were setting up the meeting, having been called by Jessica when the situation developed. She positioned herself beside my wheelchair with the protective stance that had characterized her friendship throughout this ordeal. When my parents entered the therapy room, they looked like actors playing roles they'd rehearsed extensively. Mom wore a conservative dress that suggested respectability, while Dad had traded his usual casual clothes for a suit that made him look like a defendant rather than a father. Ivy, sweetheart. Mom began using the false endearment that had become her standard greeting since the accident. We need to talk about these terrible misunderstandings that are tearing our family apart. There are no misunderstandings, I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The police have evidence of Dad's planning documents and your systematic theft from my trust fund. Dad's response revealed the same arrogance that had characterized his parenting throughout my childhood. Those documents have been taken completely out of context by people who don't understand family dynamics. Everything we did was intended to help you develop character and independence. The casual reframing of systematic abuse as character development was so audacious that it left me momentarily speechless. You researched spinal injuries 2 weeks before the birthday party, I said, watching his face for any sign of genuine remorse. You planned for me to be paralyzed and researched how to control my disability benefits. Mom stepped forward with tears that seemed calculated rather than genuine. Honey, you're misunderstanding what those papers mean. Your father was just being cautious about potential accidents, not planning anything harmful. The attempt to gaslight me into questioning documented evidence might have worked on the insecure daughter I'd been, but it had no effect on the woman I was becoming. Get out, I said quietly. Ivy, please listen to reason. Dad insisted, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had intimidated me throughout childhood. We're your parents, and we love you. Don't let strangers turn you against your own family. I said, get out. I shouted loud enough to bring hospital security running. As they were escorted from the building, Mom turned back with one final manipulation attempt. We're trying to protect you from making decisions you'll regret for the rest of your life. Don't destroy your brother's future out of anger. The words echoed in the therapy room after they left, but they carried no emotional weight. The parents who had shaped my childhood through fear and manipulation had no power over the woman I was becoming. Marcus Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, leaned forward with professional interest. That kind of psychological strength will serve you well in competitive athletics, he observed. Champions are made from people who refuse to be defeated by circumstances beyond their control. As I prepared for the physical therapy session that would continue building my new life, I realized that my parents' visit had accomplished something they hadn't intended. It had shown me exactly how far I'd come from the scared, guilty daughter who had driven to a birthday party, hoping to avoid family conflict. The woman who had just ordered her abusers to leave would never again accept minimization of her pain or manipulation of her loyalty. She was ready to face whatever consequences came from demanding justice, regardless of how it affected the people who had never protected her. The courtroom felt smaller than I'd expected when I wheeled through its doors on the first day of testimony 3 months after the accident. Media attention had transformed what should have been a family matter into a public examination of parental abuse and disability rights, with cameras capturing every moment of what would become a landmark case in Arizona legal history. District Attorney Catherine Brooks had prepared me extensively for what to expect, but nothing could have fully readied me for seeing my parents sitting at the defendant's table flanked by attorneys and wearing expressions that mixed defiance with barely concealed panic. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the evidence with devastating precision. 3 months of investigation had uncovered a paper trail of systematic abuse that extended far beyond the trampoline incident, revealing years of calculated cruelty disguised as family discipline. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, D.A. Brooks began, "This case is about parents who spent years teaching their son to view violence against his sister as entertainment, who stole hundreds of thousands of dollars intended for her security, and who planned for her to be seriously injured while researching how to exploit her resulting disability." The defense attorney Jonathan Hayes attempted to frame the case as a family tragedy blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors, but his opening statement felt hollow against the weight of documented evidence that would be presented over the following days. Danny took the witness stand on the second day, and his testimony proved to be the most damaging evidence against our parents. 3 months of intensive therapy had given him language to describe the psychological manipulation he'd endured and the systematic way our parents had cultivated his hostility toward me. They called it keeping Ivy grounded. He testified, his voice steady despite obvious emotional difficulty. "From the time I was little, they taught me that hurting her feelings or causing her minor injuries was funny and necessary to prevent her from becoming arrogant." The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray Danny as a troubled teenager, trying to blame adults for his own criminal behavior. But his detailed recollection of specific conversations and incidents, supported by the documents found in Dad's safe, made his testimony unshakable. "Can you describe the conversation you had with your father about the trampoline?" D.A. Brooks asked during redirect examination. "He said accidents happen when people get overconfident on equipment they haven't used in years," Danny replied, looking directly at Dad with a mixture of anger and hurt. Then he winked at me and said it would be educational if Ivy learned some humility the hard way. The wink. That single gesture encapsulated the casual cruelty that had defined my childhood, the way my pain had been treated as entertainment rather than concern. Dr. Kevin Ross Danny's psychiatrist testified about the systematic psychological abuse both Danny and I had experienced. His clinical terminology gave academic weight to experiences I'd struggled to articulate. The parents created what we call a scapegoat dynamic, where one child is systematically targeted for blame and punishment, while the other is rewarded for participating in the abuse, Dr. Ross explained. This pattern typically escalates over time as the targeted child becomes more independent or successful. The financial evidence presented by FBI forensic accountants revealed the stunning scope of the trust fund theft. Charts and graphs showed how my parents had systematically looted my inheritance, while I struggled with student loans and basic living expenses. The defendants withdrew over $400,000 from the victim's trust fund over an 8-year period, testified Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI investigator who had tracked the money trail. They used falsified documentation to justify expenditures that had nothing to do with the beneficiary's welfare. When my turn came to testify, I wheeled to the witness stand with Emma's supportive presence in the gallery and Uncle Marcus's encouraging nod from the family section. The courtroom fell silent as I was sworn in, and I could feel the weight of media attention and public interest focused on my words. Deb Brooks walked me through the events of the birthday party with careful attention to detail, establishing the timeline and my physical condition before and after the assault. But the most powerful part of my testimony came when she asked about the family dynamics that had preceded the incident. "Can you describe how your parents typically responded when you were injured or in pain?" she asked. "They would usually accuse me of being dramatic or seeking attention," I replied, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. Even serious injuries were dismissed as minor problems that I was exaggerating for effect. I described the pattern of dismissed injuries, the financial struggles I'd endured, while they lived comfortably on stolen money, and the way they'd consistently portrayed Danny's cruelty as normal sibling rivalry that I was too sensitive to handle appropriately. "Did you ever suspect that your brother's pranks were being encouraged by your parents?" D.A. Brooks asked. "Not until I heard his confession in the hospital," I admitted. "I thought Danny was just naturally mean to me. I didn't realize they were actively teaching him to view hurting me as entertainment." The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray me as a bitter daughter, seeking revenge against parents who had made ordinary mistakes in child-rearing. But 3 months of therapy and legal preparation had given me the confidence to respond to his questions without defensiveness or manipulation. "Miss Caldwell, isn't it true that you're hoping to profit financially from these criminal charges against your parents?" he asked. "I'm hoping to recover the money they stole from my trust fund," I replied matter-of-factly. "Money that was legally mine and was taken without my knowledge or consent." "But you're also pursuing civil lawsuits that could result in additional financial gain, correct?" "I'm pursuing lawsuits to recover damages for the permanent disability your clients caused through their systematic abuse," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "The money can't restore my ability to walk, but it can provide the resources I need to live independently despite their actions." The cross-examination continued for 2 hours, but the attorney's attempts to portray me as vindictive or financially motivated fell flat against the documented evidence of years of systematic mistreatment. Uncle Marcus testified about his growing suspicions regarding the trust fund theft and his observations of our family dynamics over the years. His testimony carried particular weight because he was testifying against his own brother, making his credibility difficult to attack. "I watched Robert and Patricia encourage Danny's aggressive behavior toward Ivy while dismissing her legitimate complaints about being hurt," he said. "It became clear that they were using Danny as a weapon against his sister, teaching him that her pain was entertaining." The evidence presentation continued for 6 days, building an overwhelming case that my parents had systematically abused both their children while stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars intended for my security. When the jury retired to deliberate, D.A. Brooks expressed confidence that the evidence supported conviction on all charges, but I found myself focused less on the legal outcome than on the public acknowledgement that what had happened to me was criminal rather than normal family dysfunction. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The speed of their decision suggested that the evidence had been as overwhelming to them as it had seemed to observers throughout the trial. As the verdicts were read, I watched my parents' faces for signs of remorse or recognition of the harm they'd caused. Instead, I saw anger defiance and what appeared to be genuine surprise that they were being held accountable for actions they apparently still viewed as reasonable parenting decisions. The conviction felt like validation of everything I'd experienced, but had been taught to minimize or dismiss. For the first time in my life, an official authority had confirmed that my pain had been real, my treatment had been wrong, and the people responsible would face genuine consequences. As we left the courthouse surrounded by media attention and public support, I realized that the scared daughter who had worried about ruining birthday parties was truly gone. Forever. In her place was a woman who had faced her abusers in open court and refused to minimize their crimes for the sake of family harmony. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been officially recognized and recorded for anyone who might question whether family violence against disabled individuals deserved serious legal response. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks after the guilty verdicts in the same courtroom that had hosted the trial, but with an atmosphere of finality rather than uncertainty. Judge Patricia Morrison had a reputation for tough sentences in family violence cases, and her preliminary comments suggested she viewed my parents' crimes as particularly serious examples of parental abuse. Before I impose sentences, Judge Morrison began, I want to address the systematic nature of the abuse documented in this case. The defendants didn't make impulsive mistakes or errors in judgment. They planned and executed a campaign of psychological, physical, and financial abuse against their own daughter that culminated in deliberate permanent disability. The courtroom was packed with disability rights advocates, family abuse survivors, and media representatives who had followed the case throughout the trial. Sarah Mitchell from the Disability Rights Alliance sat in the front row, having become both a professional colleague and personal friend during my advocacy work over the past few months. Dad was called forward first to receive his sentence. He approached the bench with his attorney wearing the same defiant expression that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial. Judge Morrison consulted her notes before delivering a sentence that sent audible gasps through the gallery. Robert Caldwell, you are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit aggravated assault trust fund fraud and attempted flight from prosecution. You will serve an additional 2 years for witness intimidation to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. 10 years total. The sentence was at the upper end of federal guidelines and reflected the judge's view that Dad's crimes warranted the harshest possible punishment. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, you are ordered to pay complete restitution in the amount of $450,000, plus interest and court costs. All assets will remain frozen until restitution is satisfied. Mom's sentencing followed immediately afterward. She approached the bench with tears streaming down her face, though whether from remorse or self-pity remained unclear. Patricia Caldwell, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit aggravated assault and trust fund fraud. You are also sentenced to 2 additional years for witness tampering to be served consecutively. 8 years total for Mom, reflecting her slightly lesser role in planning the assault, but equal participation in the financial crimes. Both defendants will serve their sentences in federal facilities with no possibility of parole, Judge Morrison announced. Upon release, you will have no contact with the victim except through court-approved restitution proceedings. No contact orders. The legal protection I'd never thought to request was being imposed, automatically ensuring that my parents couldn't manipulate or intimidate me even after serving their sentences. Before concluding these proceedings, Judge Morrison said, I want to address the broader implications of this case. The evidence presented demonstrates how family violence against disabled individuals can be systematically planned and executed while being disguised as normal parental discipline. She turned to look directly at the media section, clearly intending her words for public consumption beyond the courtroom. This case should serve as a warning to any family members who believe they can exploit or abuse disabled relatives without legal consequences. The justice system will treat family violence with the same seriousness as violence between strangers. As the formal proceedings concluded and my parents were led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. The people who had shaped my childhood through systematic abuse would spend the next decade in federal prison, unable to harm me or anyone else. Uncle Marcus approached my wheelchair as the courtroom emptied, carrying Danny with him. My brother looked older than his 17 years, marked by months of intensive therapy and the weight of testifying against our parents. Ivy, I wanted you to know that Danny has something to say. Uncle Marcus said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent a year dealing with family destruction. Danny stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared to speak. The confident teenager who had smirked while I lay paralyzed had been replaced by a young man who understood the magnitude of what had been lost. I know I can never fix what I did to you. He began, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. but I want you to know that I'm dedicating my life to making sure other families don't go through what we did." He explained that he'd been accepted to Arizona State University with a major in social work funded by a legitimate scholarship program rather than stolen trust fund money. His career goal was to work with families affected by abuse, using his experience to identify and interrupt patterns of systematic mistreatment. "I'm also working with Dr. Ross to develop educational programs about family violence against disabled individuals," he continued. "Your case has shown people that this type of abuse exists, and I want to help prevent it from happening to other families." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma and Marcus Rodriguez from the Paralympic Training Center. Over the past 3 months, my athletic training had progressed to the point where I was seriously considering trying to qualify for national competition. "Ivy, I have some news about your training progress," Marcus said, his expression mixing excitement with professional restraint. "Your times in the 800-meter wheelchair race have improved to the point where you're within qualifying range for the national team." The prospect of Paralympic competition had seemed impossible when I was learning basic wheelchair navigation in the hospital, but months of intensive training had revealed athletic capabilities I'd never known I possessed. "The next qualifier is in 2 months," Marcus continued. "If you place in the top 3, you'll be eligible for international competition and potential Olympic team selection." Olympic team selection. The phrase represented possibilities that extended far beyond athletic achievement into a future defined by excellence rather than victimization. Emma pulled out her laptop to show me the latest fundraising numbers for the advocacy foundation we'd established using settlement money from the civil lawsuit. The Ivy Caldwell Foundation for Family Violence Survivors had raised over $200,000 in its first 6 months of operation funding, legal assistance and support services for disabled abuse victims across the country. "We've helped 43 families access legal representation and recover stolen assets," Emma reported. "The foundation has become a model for how abuse survivors can transform their experiences into systematic change." As we left the courthouse surrounded by supporters and media attention, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that terrible birthday party 8 months ago. The marketing coordinator who had driven to Phoenix hoping to avoid family conflict had been replaced by someone whose story was inspiring legislation and changing how society understood family violence. That evening in my new accessible apartment funded by the recovered trust money, I prepared for a television interview that would air nationally the following morning. The interview would focus on the foundation's work and the broader need for protective services for disabled abuse victims. Dr. Martinez, who had become both my physician and friend throughout the recovery process, called to congratulate me on the sentencing outcomes and my athletic progress. "Ivy, I want you to know how proud I am of everything you've accomplished," she said. "When you arrived in my emergency department, I saw a frightened young woman whose family had failed her completely. Now you're someone who's creating systematic change to protect other people from similar experiences." The conversation reminded me of Father Miguel's observation months ago that transformation often emerges from tragedy when people refuse to be defined by their worst experiences. As I prepared for bed in my new life surrounded by Paralympic training equipment and foundation materials that represented meaningful work, I realized that my parents' attempt to destroy me had inadvertently created someone stronger than they could have imagined. The woman who would compete for Paralympic medals and advocate for legislative change bore little resemblance to the daughter who had spent years apologizing for taking up space. She was someone who had transformed victimization into victory, not through denial or forgiveness, but through the pursuit of justice and the determination to ensure other families couldn't inflict similar harm. For the first time since lying motionless on that concrete patio, I felt genuinely grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities that would have been impossible if my family had succeeded in keeping me small, dependent, and afraid. 6 months after the sentencing, my life had transformed in ways I could never have imagined during those first terrifying days in the hospital. The Paralympic training facility in Colorado had become my second home, and my wheelchair racing times had improved to the point where Olympic qualification was no longer a distant dream, but an achievable goal within the next year. The morning routine that had once involved struggling to afford basic necessities now included sponsored training sessions, media interviews about disability rights, and foundation work that was changing legislation across multiple states. The financial security provided by the Recovered Trust Fund and civil lawsuit settlements had given me something I'd never possessed: the freedom to pursue meaningful work without worrying about basic survival. Emma had become my full-time foundation coordinator, managing the administrative details that allowed me to focus on direct advocacy and athletic training. Our friendship had evolved into a working partnership that felt both professional and deeply personal, built on shared commitment to transforming my traumatic experience into systematic change. The California legislature passed the Family Violence Protection Act yesterday. Emma announced as she arrived at my training session with coffee and news updates that had become our morning ritual. That's the 5th state to adopt legislation based on your case. The Family Violence Protection Act was designed specifically to address gaps in how legal systems handle abuse cases involving disabled family members. It required mandatory reporting of suspicious injuries, created specialized courts for family violence cases, and established funding for advocacy services that had previously been unavailable. More importantly, Emma continued, the Federal Department of Justice is citing your case in their new guidelines for prosecuting family violence crimes. Your story is literally changing how the entire justice system approaches these situations. The impact felt surreal, considering that a year ago I'd been focused on managing small business marketing campaigns and avoiding family drama. Now my experience was influencing federal policy and protecting people I would never meet. Marcus Rodriguez arrived as I was finishing my warm-up routine, carrying timing equipment and wearing the focused expression that preceded serious training sessions. My 800-meter times had improved to within seconds of Paralympic qualifying standards, and we were targeting a major competition in Denver, where Olympic team scouts would be present. Today we're working on your final sprint technique. Marcus announced, setting up the timing equipment around the track. Your endurance and pace management are solid, but the last 100 meters will determine whether you make the national team. The training session pushed me to physical limits I'd discovered only through months of systematic conditioning. The woman who had once struggled to transfer from bed to wheelchair was now capable of sustaining speeds that would have seemed impossible during early rehabilitation. As I cooled down from the workout, my phone rang with a call from Dr. Martinez, who had continued monitoring my medical progress throughout the athletic training process. Her voice carried excitement that was unusual for our typically clinical check-ins. Ivy, I just received a call from the International Paralympic Committee, she said. They want to feature your story in a documentary about athlete recovery from traumatic injuries. It would involve filming your training and competition preparation over the next 6 months. A Paralympic documentary represented exposure that could amplify the Foundation's work, exponentially bringing family violence issues to international audiences who might never otherwise encounter disability rights advocacy. There's one other thing, Dr. Martinez continued. I've been contacted by medical schools that want to include your case in their curriculum about recognizing family violence against disabled patients. Your story is becoming a teaching tool for training future healthcare providers. Medical school curriculum. The systematic changes resulting from my experience were extending into professional training that could prevent other families from experiencing similar abuse. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a Federal Express delivery containing an official-looking envelope from the United States Olympic Committee. Marcus and Emma gathered around as I opened what turned out to be an invitation to the Olympic Training Center trials, where final team selections would be made for international competition. This is it, Marcus said, his voice mixing professional satisfaction with genuine excitement. You're being invited to compete against the best wheelchair racers in the country for a spot on the Olympic team. Olympic team trials. The opportunity represented athletic achievement that transcended mere competition into a platform for advocacy that could reach global audiences. That afternoon brought a video call from Danny, who was completing his first semester at Arizona State University, with grades that reflected his commitment to rebuilding his life around helping others rather than causing harm. Our relationship remained complicated, built on shared trauma and his genuine remorse, but his progress was undeniable. "Ivy, I wanted to tell you about my internship placement," he said, his image appearing on my laptop screen from his dorm room. "I'm working with the university's Family Violence Prevention program, helping develop educational materials about sibling abuse dynamics." His work was creating resources that could help other families identify and interrupt patterns of systematic abuse before they escalated to the level of serious violence. The brother who had planned to paralyze me was dedicating his life to preventing other siblings from experiencing similar betrayal. The program director says my insights about family manipulation are helping them understand how parents can weaponize one child against another. Danny continued. "It's hard to talk about what I did to you, but if it helps other families avoid our situation, then I want to keep doing this work." The conversation reminded me of something Father Miguel had said during one of his hospital visits about how redemption often requires people to transform their worst actions into service for others. Danny's commitment to prevention work represented genuine accountability rather than mere apology. Evening brought preparation for a national television interview that would air the following week, focusing on the Foundation's expansion into providing legal assistance for disabled abuse survivors across the country. The interviewer would be someone who specialized in disability rights issues, ensuring that the coverage would treat the subject with appropriate seriousness rather than sensational exploitation. As I reviewed talking points with Emma and practiced responding to potential questions about my family situation, I realized how completely my relationship with public attention had changed. The woman who had once hidden from family conflict was now comfortable advocating for controversial legislation and speaking publicly about the most traumatic experiences of her life. The Foundation has helped over 100 families in the past year. I said, practicing the statistics that would anchor the interview, but more importantly, we've demonstrated that family violence against disabled individuals is a systematic problem that requires systematic solutions. The numbers represented real people whose lives had been changed by resources that hadn't existed when I was lying paralyzed on that concrete patio, dismissed as dramatic and attention-seeking by the family that was supposed to protect me. As I prepared for bed in my accessible apartment surrounded by Paralympic training schedules and foundation materials that represented meaningful work, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from victimization to advocacy leadership. The marketing coordinator who had driven to a birthday party hoping to avoid conflict had been replaced by someone whose trauma had become a source of strength for countless other survivors. She was someone who could compete with world-class athletes while building organizations that protected vulnerable people from the systematic cruelty that had once defined her own life. Tomorrow would bring another day of training for Olympic trials while managing foundation work that was changing how society understood family violence. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities that would honor the suffering that had created them while ensuring that suffering wouldn't be repeated in other families. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely proud of who I was becoming rather than apologetic for the space I occupied in the world. 2 years after lying motionless on that concrete patio, I found myself standing at a podium in my racing wheelchair, addressing a packed auditorium at Danny's high school graduation. The journey that had begun with family betrayal and systematic abuse had evolved into something I could never have imagined, a life defined by purpose achievement and the knowledge that my suffering had created protection for countless other families. The invitation to speak at the graduation had come from Danny himself, who was graduating as valedictorian with a full scholarship to pursue graduate studies in family counseling. The brother who had once planned my destruction was now recognized as a student leader in violence prevention education. When I was your age, I began my voice carrying clearly through the sound system to an audience of teenagers and families. I believed that family loyalty meant accepting abuse and protecting people who caused harm. I thought speaking up about mistreatment was selfish, and I spent years apologizing for pain that wasn't my fault. The audience included Uncle Marcus, who had adopted Danny officially and provided the stable family environment that had allowed his transformation. It also included Emma wearing the engagement ring that represented our relationship's evolution, from friendship into a partnership built on shared advocacy work and mutual respect. But I learned something important over the past 2 years. I continued. Real love doesn't require you to accept harm. Real family protects and supports rather than exploits and manipulates. And real strength comes from refusing to let other people's cruelty define your future. In the front row sat Dr. Martinez and Father Miguel, medical and spiritual advisors who had become lifelong friends through their roles in my recovery. Behind them were representatives from the Disability Rights Alliance and Paralympic Committee colleagues who had helped transform my experience into systematic change. Your generation has the power to break cycles of abuse that have existed for decades. I said, looking directly at the graduates who would soon enter college and careers. You can choose to treat family conflict as an opportunity for growth rather than an excuse for cruelty. You can recognize that everyone deserves safety, respect, and the chance to build lives free from systematic mistreatment. The speech was interrupted by sustained applause, but I continued with the message that had become central to my advocacy work. Some of you may be experiencing family situations that feel normal but cause you pain you're told to ignore. I said, my voice softening with empathy. I want you to know that your pain matters, your safety matters, and there are people trained to help you find resources and protection. I provided information about the Foundation's new youth outreach program, designed specifically to help teenagers recognize and escape family abuse patterns before they caused permanent damage. Most importantly, I concluded, I want you to know that trauma doesn't have to define your future unless you choose to let it. You can transform your worst experiences into strength that protects other people from similar harm. After the ceremony, Danny approached my wheelchair with the same nervous energy he'd shown during our first conversation in the psychiatric hospital 2 years ago. But this time, his nervousness came from excitement about sharing good news rather than fear about confessing crimes. Ivy, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted to the doctoral program at University of Chicago. He said, his voice steady with pride. I'll be studying family systems therapy with a focus on preventing violence between siblings. The University of Chicago represented one of the top programs in the country, and Danny's acceptance reflected not just academic achievement, but recognition of his unique insights into family abuse dynamics. Additionally, he continued, I've been invited to present research at the International Conference on Family Violence next year. The presentation will focus on how parental manipulation can create abusive relationships between siblings. The conference was a prestigious venue where Danny's work would influence professionals worldwide, potentially preventing other families from experiencing the systematic abuse that had defined our childhood. Uncle Marcus joined our conversation looking proud of the young man he'd helped raise from the wreckage of our family's destruction. His own life had been transformed by his decision to step forward and protect both Danny and me from further harm. I have news too, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose difficult choices had produced positive outcomes. I've been asked to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee about family violence legislation. They want to hear from someone who witnessed the warning signs but initially felt powerless to intervene. His testimony would add family perspective to the legislative advocacy that had grown from my case, showing how systematic abuse affects entire extended family networks and how bystanders can be empowered to take protective action. Emma appeared with news about the Foundation's latest achievements, carrying a tablet displaying statistics that represented real lives changed through our advocacy work. We've helped over 500 families access legal representation and recover stolen assets, she announced. But more importantly, the legislation based on your case has been adopted in 12 states and is being considered at the federal level. 500 families represented thousands of individual people whose lives had been protected or improved through resources that hadn't existed when I was lying paralyzed and dismissed as dramatic. There's more. Emma continued pulling up a news article on her tablet. The Paralympic Committee has confirmed your selection for the national team. You'll be competing in the World Championships next month with potential Olympic qualification. World Championships, the athletic achievement that had seemed impossible during early rehabilitation, was now confirmed reality, representing excellence that transcended victimization into genuine accomplishment. As the graduation reception continued around us, I found myself reflecting on the complete transformation of my relationship with family success and public attention. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space was now comfortable commanding attention for causes larger than her personal experience. Dr. Kevin Ross, Danny's psychiatrist, approached our group with professional satisfaction evident in his expression. His work with Danny had become a model for treating adolescent perpetrators of family violence, demonstrating that even serious offenders could be rehabilitated when abuse patterns were properly understood and interrupted. Danny's transformation has been remarkable, Dr. Ross said, addressing the group, but I want to emphasize that his success is directly related to the accountability structure that Ivy's courage created. Without consequences and truth-telling, rehabilitation would have been impossible. The reminder that justice and healing were interconnected rather than opposed had become central to my advocacy message. Real forgiveness required genuine accountability, and lasting change demanded honest confrontation with harmful behaviors. As the afternoon drew to a close, I wheeled to a quiet corner of the reception hall where I could process the surreal nature of speaking at my former tormentor's graduation as an honored guest and advocate, rather than a victim seeking family approval. Father Miguel joined me in the quiet space, carrying the gentle presence that had provided comfort during the darkest moments of my recovery. "How does it feel to see how far both you and Danny have come?" he asked. "Complicated," I admitted. "I'm proud of who we've both become, but I can't forget the journey that brought us here. Sometimes I wonder what our relationship might have been like if our parents had taught us to support rather than hurt each other." Perhaps, Father Miguel said thoughtfully, but that alternative history might not have created the advocates you've both become. Your trauma was real and shouldn't have happened, but the strength you've built from it is protecting people who might otherwise suffer in silence. The perspective offered comfort without minimizing the genuine loss that family abuse had created. Both Danny and I had been forced to rebuild our personalities and relationships from the ground up, a process that was empowering but also represented profound grief for the childhood bond that had been systematically destroyed. As I prepared to leave the graduation reception, Emma and I were approached by a teenager whose nervous energy suggested she had something important to say. "Miss Caldwell, I wanted to thank you," the girl said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I heard your speech, and it helped me realize that what's happening in my family isn't normal. I'm going to call the number you gave for the foundation." The interaction reminded me that advocacy work created ripple effects that extended far beyond statistics and legislation into individual moments of recognition and courage. As we drove back to Colorado Springs, where I would continue training for World Championship competition, I reflected on the complete transformation of my life's trajectory over the past 2 years. The marketing coordinator who had driven to a birthday party worrying about gas money had been replaced by someone whose athletic achievements and advocacy work were changing how society understood family violence against disabled individuals. More importantly, the daughter who had spent years apologizing for existing had become a woman comfortable demanding accountability, setting boundaries and using her experience to protect others from similar harm. I want to ask you something important. Have you ever experienced family situations where your pain was dismissed as drama or where you felt pressured to minimize harm for the sake of family peace? The Foundation continues working to help families recognize these patterns and access resources for change. Your stories matter. Your experiences deserve validation, and there are people trained to help you build safer relationships. Please share this story with anyone who might benefit from knowing they're not alone. Like this video if it resonated with your experience. Subscribe to stay connected with advocacy updates and comment below with your thoughts about family violence prevention. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting the ongoing work to protect vulnerable family members from systematic abuse. Together, we can ensure that no child grows up believing their pain doesn't matter or that family loyalty requires accepting harm. Your courage to speak up and seek help could be the beginning of transformation that protects not just you, but countless others who deserve safety, respect, and the chance to build lives free from fear.